Hello, all.
Hello. I am going to run checks to make sure we are appearing the places we're supposed to be appearing. We're good on Twitch. Are we good on the YouTubes? We're good on the YouTubes. All systems fire.
All right, superb. I'm quite looking forward to this one because Khaine is one of those subjects that, contrary to many people's expectations, is significantly different to what most people think it's going to be to begin with. Because Khaine has changed a lot. And I do mean an awful lot. Kind of looks like it's been the same since the beginning, but trust me when I say through the course of this stream, we're going to be showing that Khaine has become something quite different to how he started, but at the same point, that route, as you chart his progress through, shows that he's never really changed that much over the course of time.
Yeah, this one, I am really excited about this. Elven Gods are something I've been really wanting to delve fully into. We kind of had a pseudo cheat one with the Lady of the Lake, but even then that was more angled towards the Bretonnian side of things as opposed to the actual elven goddess behind it herself. So getting into an actual true elf god is going to be super duper fun because they are, all of them, because of some really, really unique things we'll talk about here in a little bit, they are quite a box of worms.
Yeah, they are. I'll even go further and say that I'm actually really, really glad you chose Khaine, because Khaine, in many respects, is the starting point of the changes that are wrought upon all the elven gods, and effectively the creation of an entire pantheon and what it has meant to Khaine as well, because as we will very soon go into, Khaine has been sort of relegated into a different position to the one he originally had, but simultaneously has somehow risen because of that. And it's going to be quite fun going into that. I'm also going to say that much like normal, we're fully aware that super chats sometimes come in thick and fast. We'll be taking those in batches. We obviously have our planned content that we want to get through. And by planned, that is basically just we figured out in our heads about 2 minutes before we go live. There are planned content. One of the great joys for these streams for us is to be guided by all of you out there as you throw out questions that we didn't necessarily think were going to come up. And the answers that come from those start leading us down into some unexpected secret corners. So be aware we will be taking them in. If you've dropped in one of the super chats or if you've dropped some bits over on Twitch and we haven't answered, just make sure you drop in the comments and say, oi, you haven't brought this one up. And we will ensure that we get to it.
Yep. Also, just a quick happy Father's Day to those that had it being celebrated where you are this weekend. Hope you all had a good one, and make sure
this one here. My daughter drew this one. I'm the big tiger. She's the little one.
Make sure, of course, you would.
This is actually a recreation from her of an event that happened when she was about, I don't know, she must have been about 3, maybe 2, where she drew all over the walls her name, Laurie, all over the place. And then when I came in and I said, "Really?" She was like, "It wasn't me." I mean, who do you think it was, given the only word that you can write is Laurie? And my other daughter, of course. I'm glad to hear that.
Like your dad.
Yeah, good time. So yeah, happy Father's Day to all you dads out there, or all of you who have dads, which I presume is most of you. And if your fathers aren't there or can't be there, then of course it's a day that might be difficult for you. We fully recognize that, and we won't continue on with it, but we will say, regardless of where you are, have a marvelous day.
Yep. All right. So going from wholesome to murdery, let's get into this.
All right, let's get in. I'm going to start with one of my back in times. I'd like to take you all the way back to the 80s, because Khaine has got a long and storied history, and Khaine's story doesn't start with the elves. Khaine's story starts all the way back with Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1st edition, the first mention of Khaine, the god of murder. And Khaine was dropped in a small little corner in the Divine section, which I believe, as I recall, was put together by Graham Davis. And Khaine was, let's put it very bluntly, a very simple copy-paste of biblical Khaine, and then completely twisted. And he's a god of murder. Oh, wait, you mean like Khaine murdered stuff? What? What? Really? Is that where it came from? Yeah, that's where it came from. And it was a very simple copy paste, and then it was Warhammered up. And he was turned into a god of murder with multiple limbs and daggers and scorpions and other various accoutrements that were, let's be exceedingly blunt here, human. It was a human god. It was not an elven deity. Any way, shape, or form. At that point, there was only one elven deity dropped into the game with any certainty, a god that no longer even exists. So that's quite interesting in and of itself. And perhaps we can go to Lost Gods of the Elves in one of the streams, because there's several of them that have just been dropped over the course of time, including one god that was the patron to the War Dancers, one god that was a patron to Revelry, all gone and replaced with a different, completely different pantheon. So back in the 80s, we got our first mention of Khaine. And I used that god back then. Khaine was a relatively common deity to pop up in various roleplay games back in that era. And lots of fan material was written about him, but very little actual material was used by Games Workshop to enhance that deity. It was just one of those gods that sat in the background. It's another Warhammer god, a god of murder. However, 40K picked that one up and ran with it. When 40K completely redid their Space Elves, the Eldar, they took Khaine and went, you know what? Khaine's an elf god. And Khaine is actually the god of war amongst the elves and a god of murder too, but he represents the extremely over-emotive elves' darker side, where they have this, when they are elves being elves, and yes, they're Eldar, but they're just space elves. Get over yourselves.
Would you say you represent the dark deeds of the Eldar?
Dark deeds. Oh god, there's always an excuse to mention that, isn't there? So our Eldar were extremely emotional creatures, far more so than humans. And when they were at their darkest and most destructive, when they were going to war, their god of war was that representation, Khaine. Now, there's a whole host of stories that were added in and around that time for 40K. We're talking around about the early 1990s. 1990, White Dwarf about 127 to 130, 125, pardon me, to 130 era. And we got ourselves a bunch of new stories getting spun about elf gods. And these stories clearly sunk in, because when we reach 1993, we get our first ever army list for elves. Our first one. It's the High Elf Army List. And it was released for the 4th edition of Warhammer. Now, we've discussed that box set multiple times in previous streams, particularly because of Grom the Paunch, who we've discussed to some extent. Because that was the box set that gave you your High Elves and your Goblins as a starter. The first army list that came out, the first ever army list that was just for a single faction, was the Empire. And the second one was the Elves. And they completely changed everything. Completely. Because they took the Warhammer thing that was for humans, had been ported over to 40K for elves. It got ported back to Warhammer for elves. Yay! And Khaine became a central elven deity. And it's really interesting how they pitch it in this army list, and then later, a couple of years later, when they released the Dark Elves in the Dark Elf army list, when they take everything that the High Elf army list had and ran with it a bit, because you effectively are left with a god that is destructive and mental and over the top, Khaine, and a bunch of other gods that the High Elves worship. And that's it. And it's really fascinating when you go back to those original army lists and you look at the stories they tell, because they're the same stories that are told when we reach the later editions of Warhammer. But in this edition, they make sense, because Khaine is the only god that the Dark Elves are really interested in. The only one. And that is it. There are no extra gods in their pantheon. It's just Khaine. And the Dark Elves revel in Khaine. And Khaine, in this edition, so back in 4th edition, back in the early 90s, is completely rewritten again. He's no longer a god of war. He's gone back to his original description from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 1. He's a god of war and murder and destruction and ferocity and everything that the elves feel when they lose it to anger, when they go over the top. Remember, elves are much, much, much more emotional than any of the other species in the Warhammer world. And when they go, they really go. And in this early edition, this is the edition where it's quite clear that elves are front and center for not just their release schedule, but the Warhammer world as a whole. When orcs and goblins are discussed in their army list, it's basically just orcs and goblins run around hitting things. Ha 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 ha. When elves are discussed, it's elves reshaped the world. They fashioned everything we know. They made the winds of magic. They cursed the world. They rule. By the gods, are the elves central to everything. And this is something that until about the 6th edition of Warhammer is not deconstructed. So for a good 2 full editions, the elves are responsible for every major event in the Warhammer world. The fall of the dwarves, that was the elves. The Slan getting nowhere, elves. The destruction of the entire world, elves. Chaos coming down, oh, that was just the Dark Elves saying, you know what, we're going to help you, so down you come. Basically, everything was the elves. Every major event was tied to the elves in one stripe or another. And central to that was Khaine. And in particular, one manifestation of Khaine, the Sword of Khaine. The Sword of Khaine that was basically the sword that Khaine himself wielded when he walked the world as a god. And this is something that never changes, although it's often left to a single sentence here or there. It's worth noting this. It is clarified in every edition that at some point, all the elf gods walked the Warhammer world as gods. Actual gods. Not, oh, we've sent some servants. Oh, we've got an avatar. Oh, an elf has been possessed by us. No. They are literally there. And they are at war at some early point at the beginning of the Warhammer world. And Khaine drops his sword in the great shrine of Khaine up at the north of Ulthuan long before the cataclysm comes to an end. So that's the great war when the chaos gods come. But by this point, apparently, some random event has occurred where let's call him the divine emperor of the gods, Azurin, has said that no god is allowed to walk the Warhammer world again. So Khaine is no longer on the world, but his sword is. And this sword becomes central to, I'm just going to state it bluntly, the Warhammer world. Of all artifacts in the Warhammer world, I would argue this single individual artifact, which is a representation of the bloody-minded nature of Khaine, is pretty much key to both its survival and its destruction. Now, depending on the writer, they write it better or less well. But to just give you a quick summation, because I've got a little bit of history to go before we go into all the fun details. The Sword of Khaine represents all of the dark, destructive urges of the elves. And that apparently is enough to destroy the world. Such was the central focus on the elves. Indeed, only one single mortal has managed to take that blade and successfully wield it until the end times, and that is Anarion. And he was possessed at that point by a god. He was effectively already a god himself. And the only way he survived wielding it was because he was effectively a god. And this is worth noting, because over the course of the next 5,000 years or so, many will come to look at that weapon and consider wielding it and chicken out. Except for arguably one. Just one. Until the end times. Just one. And he was killed either by Dark Elf assassins or his own bodyguard. Such was the fear of what might happen if that weapon was wielded again, in that they feared it would bring the destruction of the world itself, or at least their species. So we have a bloody god of murder and war. And all elves worship him in this particular edition of the game. All of them. But the high elves see him as their darker side, which means that they only really think of him when they go to war, when they have to go too far. In many respects, you would argue that the Phoenix King Teflis, if you want to go look into him, is a perfect representation of the high elves going to war and manifesting that Khaine spirit. And then on the flip side, you've got the Dark Elves. And the Dark Elves, they pretty much decided that his way was the correct way. And at this point, we get our first real description of what Khaine's ways are. And they are clearly bloody destruction, but there is reasoning behind it. It's not just simply killing for the sake of killing, bloodshed for the sake of bloodshed. This is not Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows. And many believe that it is, but it absolutely isn't. For Khaine, it is about contrast, because there can be no life without death. There can be no love without hatred. There can be no goodness without badness. And Khaine believes that you have to sink into the depths to truly experience the heights. You cannot have those heights unless you have those depths. And through the course of this edition, it's hinted at. But as we then move into the next edition of the game, 5th, Dark Elves are knocked aside. Who cares about those? We hit 6th. And as we hit 6th, we get quite a lot more detail. The entirety of the back end of the 6th edition of the Army List, as I recall, is just loads of stories and lots of little extra details. And throughout the course of this, we get ourselves a very clear picture of who Khaine is. And Khaine is both the deity that we all expect him to be, a horrendous deity of unending bloodshed, but it's there for a reason. It is there to contrast. Those who worship Khaine fulfill a purpose because they provide the necessary contrast so that life can be appreciated. They believe, the Dark Elves in particular, that the High Elves have fallen to complete indolence and no longer appreciate what they have because they no longer see the horrors that they would face at all because they hide themselves from it. Where the Dark Elves confront it directly. And again, in this edition, Khaine is front and center for the Dark Elves. Completely front and center. There's no other gods. They worship only Khaine. The Chaos gods come up once or twice. And in this edition is very, very clear. The Chaos gods are something that they have to watch, something that they have to be aware of, and something that they use. It's something that's relatively important for the Khainite mentality. The Khainite mentality is you are better than everything else, and you use everything else. And that includes the 4 chaos powers and the rest of them too. Dark Elves at this point are marked in many places for using dark magic and dark sorceries, which is often equated with chaos magic. Not pure chaos magic, but using the powers of chaos for the betterment of the elves. And they study it, they watch it, they have entire towers set up, literally just to watch the shifting winds of magic and the realm of chaos to tell the future, and to also bind those powers to their will. So these Dark Elves are not chaos worshippers by any stretch. They are Khaine worshippers. They believe themselves to be better than anyone else, and they sacrifice a lot of people, particularly those who are not capable of defending themselves, purely because they believe that those sacrifices are absolutely necessary for their own betterment and their own psychology, for want of a better description. But then it completely changes again. Because after 6th, we hit 7th. And this is where Gav Thorpe takes over. Previously, we had, I think, our very first army list was Andy Chambers and Bill King. Bill King doing most of the background writing. Then we moved over to Gav being part of the team with, I can't remember, was it Thomas and I think Space McQuirk? Doesn't really matter. But Gav Thorpe takes over and he completely changes everything for Khaine and the Dark Elves. And it's worth knowing that before we dive into Khaine in particular, because he adds an entire pantheon in 7th edition and says that Khaine is merely one part of it and, really controversially, is not the most powerful part of it. That goes to the Pale Queen, Erith Khail. Khaine is just one god amongst many, and the story is deepened significantly here. It's where beforehand Khaine was just the god of war that all the elves fell behind. It's far more deeply embedded into the psyche of Nagarath, the northern province of Ulthuan, where the Witch King, the creator, you could argue, of the Dark Elves, came from. Where Inarian, who drew the Sword of Khaine, came from. Where the Sword of Khaine itself pretty much is embedded in the Northern Islands. I said Ireland's there. Islands, I mean. Not Northern Ireland. Ireland. So, embedded up there in the north. And the worship of Khaine is interestingly embedded into these Dark Elves, these warlike elves who had fought against chaos in the first wars, and Khaine had become their central deity. And then when they eventually fell to Cataclysm and Malekith goes in his own direction, Khaine continued to be, until you read the fine print and you realize that's not the case at all. In the slightest. That's just not. Because in the 7th edition, It marks out exactly what Khaine is, a cult of pleasure. And now that is fundamental and just a little bit surprising for many. And as we're probably going to go into at some point, there are lots of hints here that Khaine worship is not necessarily what Khaine worship should be, although I'm going to argue that it absolutely is. But it makes it quite clear in the 7th edition that the cults of pleasure, as in cults that were giving themselves over to excess and were often tied directly through to Morathi, the Witch King's mum. We're going to have to do a stream about her someday because she's properly over the top. Were taking over Elven society. And one of the primary cults that had been ported over with the Dark Elves towards their new founded land over in Nagaroth was the pleasure cult of Khaine, where they were giving themselves into excess, murder, and sacrifice. And that the Witch King himself saw this as an opportunity. Almost certainly because Morathi said, this is an opportunity. And I'll explain why in a moment. And the Witch King said, you know what? I'm actually the avatar of Khaine. Khaine's great. Here's a big shrine of Khaine.
I have a mandate of heaven all along. What a surprise.
Everything about Khaine is me. Makes sense. Nagaroth, where I was born. My dad, Khaine, Sword of Khaine. Yeah, Khaine. I'm Khaine. Let the sacrifices flow. I will use my own divine blood to help those sacrifices go along. It's absolutely brilliant. Let's spread Khaine worship everywhere to the detriment of the other gods. This is a new addition to the story. Completely new. Beforehand, it was just Khaine from the beginning. Now it's Khaine as one of many cults, and the Witch King takes that cult and basically asserts it as the core cult of the Dark Elves. And where it's centered in Harganeth, they are given a great deal of leeway to do whatever they wish. We have ourselves a new version of Khaine, a Khaine that is a god that has risen up amongst a pantheon of gods to be the most important to the Dark Elves, but is only one of many, and the Dark Elves are actively worshipping, multiple gods, goddesses, and more. Worshipping might not be the best word to put it, perhaps respecting, or at least being aware of, depending upon exactly what version of Dark Elf psyche you want to go with. And that's fascinating, because we've got ourselves a very different story. But the story changes again, because right from the beginning, all the way back in 4th edition, there had been the addition of the Cauldron of Blood. Now, the Cauldron of Blood is something that is definitely worth discussing before we hit this 8th edition. Because the Cauldron of Blood, put simply, is a big, gigantic cauldron of blood dedicated to Khaine, where witch elves do all the stabbings. All the blood goes into the good old cauldron after the sacrifices are done. And the oldest witch elves bathe in it because back in the original version of Warhammer, elves grew old. They just did. They no longer do. So witch elves stand out, particularly the hag witch elves. Is this weird oddity that sort of stands there. But back then, elves could grow old, and they faded, and they got wrinkly, and they got a bit weird as they hit their elder years, generally about 1,000 years or so. That's no longer the case. But it is, strangely enough, for the hag queens, not the hag queens, pardon me, the hag witches. The oldest of the witch elves who bathe in the blood, and Morathi herself who bathes in the blood of one of these cauldrons. But the story of the cauldron changes. To begin with, these are just great magical devices that have been put in place from Khaine, because Khaine was everything in the early editions. And they changed into something that was given to the witch elves by Morathi. She gives them the cauldrons, and she says, look, use these for your eternal youth. Yay! And they're like, yay, sacrifice, yay! And she effectively takes control of all the brides of Khaine completely. 100% they're under her thumb. And repeated times, various large figures like Hellebrand, who is the oldest of the witch elves, other than the first bride of Khaine herself, Morathi, and other very old hags have we can politically outmaneuver the good old Morathi. Yet there's not just one or two stories. It's actually called out, I think, in the 6th edition of the army list. A lovely story is just Morathi chatting to Malekith saying, yeah, the witch elves are all mine. I just let them think they're not because they're just basically mine. I control them. They're my bitches. And that's a super fascinating thing to think about as we move on to describe who the witch elves are, what everything else is, and the Lord. So that was a fascinating place, because basically we've now got ourselves the witch elves, who are the brides of Khaine. We'll go into that a little bit later, and are doing most of the sacrifices, filling up their big blood cauldrons, and then using that to keep the oldest of them with their beautiful youth, because Khaine likes them to be young and beautiful. And I have some words to say about that later. And we've got ourselves Khaine no longer being the central deity of the Dark Elves, but just being one amongst many, but being the most important one because of the Witch King's choice. He was the one that put Khaine front and central because it benefited his perspective as to what he wanted the elves to focus upon. Then we hit 8th, and 8th mixes it up even more. And I really quite love the fact that it did, because it adds yet more depth. Where we've got ourselves from 7th edition, a pretty clear picture of what they are. So we move into 8th. The cauldrons are expanded a little bit more. Marathi's got the perfect cauldron. Everyone else has got their broken cauldrons. So they can't quite keep themselves young the way they should be. But it's made quite clear that these cauldrons come from Khaine himself and were given to her. And this is fascinating. She received them all the way back when the gods themselves were walking during maybe the cataclysm, before the cataclysm, about that time. So she is arguably the first bride of Khaine, quite literally. But this contradicts other points, which we're going to have to discuss as we move on. So these cauldrons are super important, and she has used them to spread Khaine worship in a variety of interesting ways and to control it. And Khaine worship is very much put in place by her son, which is also largely, let's say, the most powerful figure in all of Nagaroth. It's all underneath their thumbs. And that's where we end up with Khaine in the last edition, where we have ourselves a great god of murder, bloodshed, extreme violence that represents the violence that lies in the heart of every single elf. That's not a thing where you go, oh, some elves, you know, they're real pacifist. No elf is a pacifist. Not one. They are all extreme of the worst. They're all capable, pardon me, of the most worst extreme acts of violence that you can imagine, because Khaine is in all their hearts, because Anarion drew the blade. But he is in the hearts of the Dark Elves more than any other, because their leader is literally the child of the person that drew Khaine's holy sword, which has its own little stories that sits in the background and who created it and all the rest of it. And we hit 8th edition, which gives us a complicated pantheon of gods, which gives Khaine being one of, and no longer the most important, arguably, because 8th edition adds new units to the game that are dedicated to other gods. In every single previous edition, the only units we had for Dark Elves were either completely dedicated to Khaine, worshipped Khaine, said Khaine was the best, or hit the battlefield without much of a description. That was it. And then through the course of 8th edition, we suddenly started getting Sisters of Slaughter. Bay, or whatever they're called. Sisters of Slaughter? That's not right, is it? Yeah, Sisters of Slaughter. Thank you. The Sisters of Slaughter, who were dedicated to Eldrazor. We got ourselves the Bloodrat Medusae. Again, very closely tied to Marathi. But again, Atharti was the primary goddess that was working through there. Indeed, 8th mixed it up and showed that the Dark Elves were as complicated as 7th edition had portrayed them, and that Khaine was not central to everything. And that is the edition we were left with, and I will also argue is the edition that most writers of Warhammer have forgotten. Because whenever they say Dark Elves, they say Khaine. So, my quick opening... quick, half an hour. My quick opening is Khaine starts as a human deity. Khaine then ports over to 40k and becomes Kahala Mensha Khaine over there, the bloody-handed god. The bloody-handed god is ported back to Warhammer and is significantly expanded. And when I say he's ported back, I mean he's ported back perfectly. If you go to the first description of the Shrine of Khaine in 4th edition army list, you've got the big shrine. It's all a big black pyramid, the Shrine of Khaine, with this big, huge crystal shard of a blade thrust into the heart of the pyramid, a blade that will appear as a different weapon, whoever sees it. And blood pours from it all times, and any elves that get close to it start feeling that onrush of violence. And surrounding this is a great plain of bone from battles from previous eras, many of which predate the elves themselves. And around that is a great circle of menhirs showing the 1,000 aspects of Khaine, including the wounded warrior, the striking scorpion, the swooping hawk. All of this is written into the army list, much of which is just uplift and drop of terms from Warhammer 40k. And in Warhammer 40k, Khaine will be shattered into those 1,000 different versions of himself, the avatars of Khaine that each of the craft worlds have. But in Warhammer, he's never shattered. He is still the perfect God of War.
He's still strong.
And he is proper powerful. And that is moved on to Khaine being just one of multiple gods. So the supreme power that we have in the early edition turns into a more balanced version, a far more complicated pantheon, a far more expressive version of what elven divinity is, with great priestesses and priests, although I don't think that's necessarily the best word for them, spread around, using Khaine as just one of the many gods of the elves. There you go. That's some sort of a start.
That is it's a start. I think Nagash got resurrected and died in the time over that intro.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna knock out super chats real quick, and then we're gonna start diving into a lot of stuff because I have a lot of questions from myself to Andy as we work through particular aspects of what Khaine has become. Because if you didn't gather from that intro, as far as the gods of Warhammer go, he's kind of complicated. Matt Ladroth, sorry if I missed the stream. Does Khaine have avatars in fantasy like 40k? If not, why? Also, can Khaine protect worshippers from Slaanesh after they die? So, does he have avatars in fantasy like he does in 40k? Not in the sense that there are not giant, that iconic model from 40k. Those don't exist in fantasy.
You know what? You're not quite right.
Of the time.
You're not quite right. You're close. There's no avatars. Let's be very blunt. We don't have our young kings going up and presenting themselves and effectively manifesting an aspect of Khaine.
Unless it's Orion, but sure.
Okay. But quite. Orion's a different thing. Well, we can get over to Orion in another stream. But what we do have is Malekith has found a way to effectively make gigantic constructs. Much like you see down in Khemri, and this is popped in the 8th edition army list and a few other places, where the great statues you often see of Khaine, and they're presented in multiple places, great iron wrought, horrific entities that look like the avatar of Khaine from 40k. They can empower them with all the spirits that have been sacrificed to the various altars of Khaine through the Cauldrons of Blood and elsewhere, and they go to war. This is a unit that's never really hit Warhammer, as far as I'm aware. Not least that I've seen.
It is a unit in Age of Sigmar. They would let
you. It's a unit in Age of Sigmar. There you go. I don't follow Age of Sigmar.
Yeah, I don't know if it still is, but I know for the first, I know for at least 2 editions, you could take the statue on the back of the Khaine model and play it as its own mini.
Well, there you go.
It was still a statue. It was the big. In Warhammer scales, they're often really bigger than greater demons in some cases, at least the smaller versions of them. So they don't have avatars of Khaine, but they do have Khaine going to war as massive iron statues billowing with the heat of his own hatred, looking exactly like an avatar of Khaine in Warhammer. So we have something that looks the same but isn't actually the same. On the second part, do you want to jump on that one? Yeah, generally speaking, the answer is no.
Yeah. Khaine, it's not Khaine's. There is lots of mentions in the broader roleplay lore of Khaine's screaming hells, and a variety of other things that exist, but they are always human leaning. But this gets really dirtied up a little bit in the 6th edition of the Warhammer Army List. At the back of that, there's a little one-page spread with a bunch of letters. And it's a letter presented to Karl Franz about cults of Khaine, saying that they exist in the Empire and they have existed there for a good couple of 100 years. There's a nice little bit about there saying that basically Khaine that is worshipped in the old world is the elven god Khaine. There's no difference. And I found that a fascinating addition when it very first came out, because at that point, the idea was that the gods were all separate and that each species had their own ones. And it wasn't just blown out of the water by this. It became standard practice to say that some of the gods that others said were different, like, for example, Salyak and Shalia. No, same god. Just because the worshipper split them in no way means that they are split in reality. And in this case, we have a clear example of where an elven god and a human god are one and the same. And that's quite fun. So do they protect elves from Slaanesh? No, there are other routes to doing that. But does Khaine have his own screaming bloody hells? Yes.
Yeah, Khaine very rarely, but occasionally will have an almost necromantic leaning from time to time, where like spirits will get somehow bound to him and unleashed. But it doesn't seem like it's a good thing. It doesn't seem like something you want.
It's super fun because they wherever there's been an awful lot of sacrifice to Khaine, say for example in Anlek. Anlek is the old capital where Inarian used to rule up in the north of Ulthuan, and it got flat. Largely because of Malekith's deeds when the Sundering happened and it all flooded in.
And then they rebuild it, and it gets flattened
again.
And then
they rebuild it, and it gets broken down again, and so on. But upon the rebuild and breakdown, so many high elves had been sacrificed there that to this day, the souls of them still scream in the waters. And they are still there. So there is always that screaming hells of Khaine thing going on, suggesting that Khaine has managed to claim souls that Slaanesh just never got its hands on. So there is definitely something there, but I would argue that that speaks more to the different fragmented nature of the soul and how it manifests, rather than necessarily Khaine claiming them. In that, parts of the soul hang on, and the rest of it probably went to Slaanesh.
Yep. Where is your bloody hand tribute, Andy?
I'll just say that I'm in a bit of a mess at this side. I spent most of this afternoon trying to just get the internet working here because you may notice sitting over in that corner over there, that's quite literally my air conditioners that are getting installed tomorrow. And I've got 2 rooms in my house which are largely emptied. It's a bit of a mess here, but I got online and I'm here. So you're just going to presume the blood is on my hand.
just go watch the LAWhammer Wolfram campaign. There's so much blood on Andy's hands. I'm more familiar with this 40K version, but how different is it from fantasy? We will talk about that heavily over the course of the stream. They are simultaneously very similar and yet more different than you probably expect.
Yeah, I agree completely. Particularly because the 40K version goes through a very different story with the birth of Slaanesh, where the Warhammer version does not have that to contend with.
Yeah, T-Blam, the Sword of Khaine is also named Widowmaker and Godslayer. Any link with the White Widow from Kislev that never reached publication?
No.
There you go. No. That being said,
I wrote a significant amount of stuff about. In fact, in many respects, I fashioned the term Ancient Widow myself when we were busy trying to figure out how to sort out Kislev first time round. And there was never any intent for that to be connected to Widowmaker in the slightest. At that point, but that doesn't mean that someone else won't pick that up and run with it later.
Yeah, I was gonna say, if you go watch, funny enough, our Hags of Kislev stream or Lordbeard episode, we actually talk about that. You could very easily run with the theory of whatever makes the Ancient Widow has to do with Khaine, and that would be a really cool way for that sword to get its name, because God slaying is an important thing. Continuing the saga, complete the Throne of Chaos. Yep, be sure to join us on Wednesday night for that. Platinum Killer, gonna miss the show as it's the first Father's Day in our household.
Congratulations! I remember my first Father's Day. It was exactly 19 years ago.
Our little one turns 1 on Wednesday. Thinking of all the baby snuggles during Sunday lore beers this past year. Thanks, gents.
Oh, thank you very much in return.
Thank you. Hope you're celebrating well. Sean, off topic, but I'm making some Empire Swordsmen. Why are these Empire shields so small compared to the Elf or Dwarf shields?
Because elf arms, they're not quite. The elves are taller, and dwarf arms are really stocky. I mean, I can make some crappy excuses, but it's made that way. I agree with you, by the way, because I was making some Empire dudes. Same problem.
GW's like, no, you only get a 6-up save. Fuck your guys.
Yeah, quite. Bloody hell.
Barnes, morning, Andy. It's Sotek's 1 a.m. over here in Australia. Khaine representing the highest of highs and lowest of lows. This seems rather Slaaneshi, and why witch elves and the cultists of Khaine are fixated on beauty.
Okay, this is a good one.
That is a good one. And there's a lot there we're going to dive into in just a moment here in a minute.
Yeah, to not dismiss it entirely, I'll give you a very quick answer before we go on to it. They are part of elven psyche. All elves are excess by their nature. So all elven gods, to their own degree, are excess. Basically, all elves are what we would consider as humans, be it deeply, deeply, deeply neural atypical. They are way beyond us in terms of what they consider to be normal fixations on things. They get hyper emotional, hyper obsessive, and what we consider to be, holy shit, they're going a bit far. They do not consider going a bit far. For them, going a bit far would be doing that over the course of maybe 200 years without doing anything else. Then you're perhaps pushing it a bit. But in this particular case, this is nothing more than elves being elves.
Yeah, there's a noble reason Slaanesh has such a strong claim on the souls of all elves. Dark Elves have long fascinated me, and they're in part to their loving canine devotion and Malekith, the pleasure cult of murder, direction, clicks, go on. Yes, we shall go on, and we are going to be talking a lot about the cult of pleasure and how it wraps up with Khaine and all that stuff. Laughing God, how does the fantasy version of my buddy Khaine reconcile the Slaaneshi influences upon his first bride Morathi? Wouldn't he be jealous? So there's a lot to unpack there. That's the first thing we're going to start with is Morathi. And
Morathi's a fascinating one because she is a walking contradiction.
Yeah,
and
so
she has been written by different people to different degrees, and they have some writers written things that literally deeply contradict what others have done. So this is going to be a topic I'm looking forward to diving into.
Jonathan Scott, the weirdest difference of Khaine 40k versus Warhammer Fantasy, in my opinion, is that in the former, he serves a purpose despite being evilish, and the latter, he's just evil. That's not true. That is not true at all.
I disagree significantly, Jonathan. And that's mostly because people focus upon what the elves do. They don't focus on why.
Yeah, the biggest trap to fall into, and this is something we've talked a lot about on the show, and I see a lot of the comments, and I assume they're jokes. But just in case they're not, I do want to reiterate something you'll hear a lot on Lorebeards is talk about how, like, Dark Elves are not, in the grand scheme of the Warhammer world, the Dark Elves are not evil, in the sense that there is a reasoning behind a lot of the things that they do that, from a human perspective, like, if you take me and you put me in a room with a Dark Elf, I'm going to look over and go, that guy's evil as fuck. But if you're dealing with an in-universe spectrum where you have the threat of chaos looming off to the side, there is, and you take into account the perspective that elves have on life, Khaine is not evil by any means of the imagination. The Dark Elves, arguably, you have to remember that Khaine, a lot of people also conflate that, everything Dark Elves must do must be all that Khaine represents, therefore Khaine is just as bad as the Dark Elves. But that's not true, especially because the High Elves and the Wood Elves also worship Khaine, but they worship him more in moderation, or they use certain checks and balances to not do Khaine with wild abandon all the time. I mean, they do have moments of wild abandon for Khaine, but don't conflate some of Khaine's worshippers with everything that Khaine is. And we'll get into, there's a lot of strong mythology among the elves, which is really fun, about how Khaine, even if he is destructive, because he is a necessary force of destruction.
Yeah. I'll add a slightly different distinction on the good-evil spectrum, because good and evil is always subjective. There's a lovely bit in the back of the 6th edition Dark Elf Army list that tells you basically the tale of how the Dark Elves got to where they came from their perspective, and it's all the fucking awful elves of Ulthuan. They're twisted and evil and wrong. They're just broken and just weak and terrible and awful. And it's worth having a look at that, because Dark Elves do not perceive themselves as evil. But from our moral perspective, they absolutely are. So a different way of viewing this might be, they are not a force of chaos. They aren't. And in the Warhammer world, chaos versus order is one of the behind-the-scenes constant themes that pop up again and again. And the Dark Elves, if you want to position them on the good guy, bad guy, if you have to do that, may often fall on the bad guy's side, but at heart are ultimately not chaos and not bad guys. They're a fascinating, interesting place, but they are morally repugnant. They are the worst in so many different ways. And much of that is because of how they view Khaine. But equally, much of how they view Khaine is through the lens of what it has become underneath the stewardship of Marathi and Malekith.
Sage where would be the most interesting place for 40k Avatar of Khaine to end up in Warhammer Fantasy? I mean, yeah. I mean, it wouldn't be that big of a shock for one to show up. Not really at all. It would be a dramatic event, but just because nothing of that caliber has gone off. But
I'd actually argue an Avatar of Khaine wouldn't be that big a deal.
Yeah, it would be an interesting surprise for those around it. But
absolutely. It's going to make all the elves use up and go to war and all the rest. But then so is 1,000 other things that they get themselves incorporated with. There is a great deal of divine interference with the elves. And an Avatar of Khaine is just one more expression of the many crazy things that elves have at their disposal.
Yeah, it was always
Oh, do you want to go?
It was always a little weird. It never made the jump to fantasy, like during its time of that. Like it's, I mean, if you think about it, like to put it very bluntly, if a storm of chaos ever got anywhere near Hargoneth, one of these things would have popped out. Like,
yeah, but I think it would. If it was being done, it would have to be done differently because the avatars of Khaine are in many respects the fragmented parts of that god in 40k, where in Warhammer, just not the case. That god is not fragmented. That god simply does not walk in the material plane and will not do so until Ranadandra. And sadly, it never really happened the way it should have done come the end times, because come the end times, Khaine should have been there. Literally.
They made artwork of it.
Not an avatar, not somebody coming in. Khaine himself should have come up and picked up his own frickin' sword and gone, it's a sword, everyone. It's why it's called the Sword of Khaine, because it's mine. And that would have been one hell of a fight come the end, rather than somebody becoming an avatar of Khaine or being possessed or something similar.
Well, they were too lazy to make a new mini. But
we might be.
Yeah. Like game, David, don't know a damn thing about Khaine. Maybe a dumb question. Is it possible Neri took the place of Khaine? I would say no. No. Yeah.
Loosely speaking, we can say exactly what happened with Anarion and Khaine. And Anarion, at the end of the Cataclysm, wanted to save all the elves. He appealed to Azurin, the Divine Emperor, and the Divine Emperor ignored him. So he said, please, go on, pretty please, sacrifices his own life, and Anarion gets possessed by the god, the Divine Emperor himself. He becomes the first avatar. He then steps out as an avatar of a god, kicks ass, chews gum, kills greater demons like they're nothing, and then eventually, after horrors upon horrors, decides to pick up the Sword of Khaine, even though that is prophesied to doom the world. So he draws it, and in doing so, arguably, dooms the world, but has Khaine's weapon, a weapon that was designed for him to slay anything, including gods. And he becomes the kick-ass chew gum and I'm all out of gum character of Warhammer, where he wanders around for a good few decades, killing anything that faces him. That is not because he's replaced Khaine. It's simply because he's got Khaine's sword. That's it. It is nothing more complicated than that. Don't try to make it the curse has come from Khaine or whatever. It's simply that he's not a god. He's only an avatar. The curse comes because he's too weak to bear that weapon. It absolutely ruins.
Yeah, trying to stuff a full gun to an itty bitty elf body. Black Dracula. So this one, we're gonna come back to this very heavy in a little bit. About fantasy, because it's very important, but very poorly explained, and we're gonna come back to that in just a minute.
Agreed completely.
Muffin Bags, can elves don a mask of Khaine like in 40k Aspect Warriors? Khaine influence on Eldar was the biggest draw to me for 40k and Dark Elves. No.
No, sadly. It's interesting because the masks of Khaine, so to speak, the aspects of Khaine, are described in Warhammer in several sources. The very first source was back in 1993 with the 4th edition of the Army List, where they talk about the Wounded Warrior, they talk about the Striking Scorpion, and so on and so forth. And it's then speckled after that first reference every once in a while, because some people go back to the original Army List and they just go Control-C, Control-V, and maybe edit it a little bit. So the aspects of Khaine do exist in the Warhammer world, in the lore, in various places, but they have never, ever been used. Could they be? I think so. And you could argue even that what became the God of Destruction on the later versions in 7th and 8th edition, when Gav Thorpe completely changed the pantheon, and I don't want to go into this in any detail because there's a whole bunch of other gods as well.
We don't have
effectively the god with all of the divine children, and most of which died, each one of them being a different aspect of destruction. You could argue that either that has replaced it, or that in some respects, all of the gods have got a bit of this, in that they are all filled with the different aspects of the very thing that they represent. One with the aspects of war and bloodshed, another one with the aspects of destruction. So there's lots that could be considered here, but no writer has yet to pick it up.
I'm going to get through these last 3 super chats real quick because we got a lot of shit to talk about, and we're so behind on time. Given his cult mostly consisting of his brides of obvious sexual themes, is there sexual aspects to Kaine's portfolio, or was that dropped?
It was not dropped. It's in 8th edition. In 8th edition, in fact, they quite clearly mark that on Death Knight, we'll get into Death Knight very soon, but on Death Knight ends, particularly in Harganeth, with basically a giant orgy. They try to pitch it with careful terms, but they quite clearly mark that those that survive are the elves, particularly, they're all fucking away like mad at the end of it. Yeah, those aspects haven't gone, particularly when you look at how the brides of Khaine are described.
Yeah, we'll talk more about this in a moment, because it could be some argument that this is due to Morathi's particular influence on the cult of Khaine in Naggaroth, as opposed to how Khaine is revered or worshipped in other parts of the world by the different kinds of elves. But in Dark Elf culture,
Khaine is horny.
Yeah, and that could very well be the case as well. I mean, Khaine literally had 2 ladies fighting over him in the later editions of like the gods dramas, and he has a whole thing with Authority and Hakardi, and he desires Aisha very much for himself. So he seems to be a pretty horny guy. He's very passionate.
That around.
Dark Elves don't exist. They're a myth. And if they do, then why does 95% of their lore revolve around only 3 people? Drew Hooks, more like.
You know what, Phil? That's actually not unfair, but I think that's because all of the initial writing from the 4th edition was focused on Khaine and how Khaine came about because of those 2. And the later writing comes along, and they have that to contend with. And most of them don't necessarily embellish it in a good way. I will say, though, that I feel that Gav Thorpe, when he came in the 7th edition, did an extraordinarily good job of making the Dark Elves feel much more real, making sense of Khaine within a pantheon, and also making sense of Khaine as a deity that actually is not just murder, bloodshed. That's great, right, you edgelord? No, there's a lot more detail added, and that got reaffirmed, and I would argue quite well as we moved into 8th.
All right, still loading. Isn't Khaine isn't a god of the Elgi? Did he kill a brother?
Yes. Yes, he did.
Yeah, which is a whole thing, because like if you read through the stories, they talk about Kaine's sister. You don't hear about Khaine's any other siblings, because his sister's Aneth Rhaema, the Savage Huntress. Yeah. But all right, so that leads into some stuff that I'm going to point out and talk about for a hot minute.
I should have a drink.
And we're going to get my little once I get through my little ramble, I have a lot of questions. We're going to take Andy to task, so to speak. So, Khaine is a very, very interesting god, as you've probably gathered by all of the discussion amongst super chats and Andrew's intro and everything. That we have a god here who, we do need Talaris, good old Talaris Dreadbringer. Khaine is probably more than any other thing in Warhammer Fantasy has so much of the 40k fingerprints all over him that it's pretty much you have to take in his 40k lore a fair bit when discussing him in fantasy, or else you're going to be missing several key details. A lot of things that are not actually that well explained within the fantasy setting, because it's almost like the writers kind of expect you to know from the 40k stuff instead of properly explaining all of the details. One of the things that an earlier super chat asked about that I agree immensely about is from Black Dracula, is the whole concept of the war in heaven, which a lot of people think did not happen in fantasy, but it did. It is 100% canonical, and get ready to try and stretch your brains that before the coming of chaos, so before the dark gods were...
I'm going to interject there and say possibly before. It could be the early part of the Coming of Chaos.
Okay, so
because the lore is vague enough that it could be. There's a large period of time it could sit in.
Yeah, before all the shit happens at the end of the Cataclysm. We'll go with that. Before the creation of the Vortex, there is the War in Heaven, which details 3 kind of major cycles. The first major cycle is that there is not, I don't want to call it the fall, but there is a sundering of sorts among the elven gods that gets really ugly, that involves Khaine, and mostly Khaine, picking a fight with a lot of the other, what we know as the Kadai, the heavenly gods. So we get like Khaine versus Kurnos, Khaine fighting with Vol, Khaine, it's not, you know, the assault of Aisha is one of the stories in there. Like, and there's Khaine fighting everybody, and he kicks everybody's ass. Like, it's horrible. Khaine bodies everybody. That's the first major cycle.
Enslaves Vol.
Yes, he enslaves Vol.
Vol.
Yeah. And it's a whole bad thing. The second cycle then builds up to Ashurin finally getting off of his throne and realizing that he has to deal with Khaine.
Nope.
Oh.
Nope. Ashurin's dead by that point. Yeah, he's dead by then.
So this falls under a case of, if you just read through the army books, that's not written anywhere. Like, Andy said that to me, and I go, I don't have a source for that, Andy. Yeah. I can't agree with that. I don't have a source for it.
The first one that comes to mind is the Tome of Salvation, where it's during the war against Chaos, and Azurin is dead, most likely killed by one of the Chaos gods. And there's very few of the Kadai left, and they are waging war against Chaos on the pyramid, the shrine of Azurin. And Azurin resurrects himself and basically does what will later be done by Inarian and kicks Chaos ass. So we know that there is a period where there are one group of gods who are separated that Azurin returns to and becomes the divine phoenix and is resurrected, which is the whole point of his phoenix imagery. And with his bifurcated mask, which is basically just a yin-yang symbol, by the way, if you didn't know. The yin-yang symbol is directly related to the Kadai and the Kairathi is the dark and the light. Is basically just one of the core symbols of the High Elves, which is also a core symbol of magic across the Warhammer world. But yeah, he was dead, and he comes back, and then after he comes back comes the commandment that I presume you're about to move on with your third cycle.
Okay, so we have the first cycle where civil war among the gods happens, but most importantly, Ashurin doesn't get involved. Second one is chaos gods start fighting everybody, and I mean everybody. And it turns into a huge fucking mess. Ashurin dies, comes back. Chaos is kind of, sort of, like dealt with in a way. And then the third phase is Ashurin finally defeats Khaine, and it's a mess.
I don't think anywhere says that he really defeats Khaine.
So I will say this is one of those things that gets messy because it's in particular part of the end times setup storyline, because they use that in the end times of just like it happened in the War in Heaven. Yeah, it happens again where Ashurin barely manages to defeat Khaine. Yeah, and pushes him back at the very least.
Yeah. So this can all be super easily rationalized if you're looking to do so. And I only say that because I wrote it around about 6 months ago. Yeah, I know. For my own game.
how nice and clean I made that sound. It is one of the messiest fucking things in the entire lore, because it is a bitch to find anything on it.
Yeah, I don't just agree with this. It's one of my biggest bugbears in general. And when I was planning out the elf book, which was 5 years ago now? Holy moly. So there's going to be an elf book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and someone else is doing it now, and I presume it'll be out soon. But when I was planning that one out, the War in Heaven was a core component of what I was writing. And I have rewritten it with a slightly different angle for my current game in LAWhammer. And interestingly, Lindsay has been recording some samples for how that's going to be produced, because we've basically explained the War of Heaven, at least for our game. But the lore is here exceedingly messy. And it's exceedingly messy largely because much of it, if you take it at face value, contradicts the arrival of the old ones and what the old ones did to the world and when. There's only one way you can make it make very clean sense, and there's lots of ways you can make it make messy sense. My preference is for the clean version, because I like everything gently clicking together like lots of cogs working towards a beautiful ticking clock. And that's that the rebellion of the gods and the gods all going against each other is when Azurin dies. And it's his death that causes all the gods to go into this state of, we no longer have a plan to deal with chaos, and they all take different routes. The Kadai and the Kairathi form from this, as they have very different conflicting views as to how they resolve the Great War against chaos. And eventually, cut a long story short, chaos largely kicks their ass until Azurin returns and puts it all to bed. And that includes putting Khaine to bed as well, and his dissatisfaction with listening to anything that a returned Azurin would ever say. But the lore on this is nothing more than a disparate story here, another disparate story there, another attempt to make sense of it by a writer who's only read maybe 2 or 3 of those parts and didn't realize that someone else had already fixed the bit that he's fixing with a different story now. Again, so we have ourselves, if we're trying to make sense of it all, a very fragmented picture. Having said that, though, that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Yes,
because
it is.
We are dealing with a mythical time. We are dealing with... yeah, we are dealing with an era where there was absolute all-out war. You could argue that one of the best Warhammer settings that have never been properly examined is the Cataclysm. What actually happened, the destruction of the old ones, the gods that were walking the world at that point. Why weren't the Chaos gods walking the world, or were they? And were they also banished? There's lots of fun questions that are to be asked, because the Chaos gods exist. The elf gods, and I would argue here that possibly we just say the gods exist. There's no real distinction there. They're just gods, and in the Aether, there's lots of gods, and some of them tried to destroy the world completely. Others did not, and they went to war, and we have a very, very easy description for that in the lore, the War in Heaven. So the War in Heaven, it seems to be very easily attached to the gods going to war.
Yeah, and just as a couple of highlights for you all to once again showcase how fucking messy but potentially awesome the War in Heaven is you may just some like quick highlights, and I want to talk about some Khaine specific ones, but just some general, just off ones of like, hey, you know that Andy talked about the defense of the pyramid? There was literal like a siege of a floating godly pyramid up in the heavens by the dark gods. And some of the gods that were fighting there, you go, oh, of course, the Elven Pantheon was there. No, it was more than just the Elf Pantheon. A lot of the human gods were there. Like it's purported that likes of Ulrich and Tal were running around in that fight. Sotek was there, despite the fact he's not supposed to exist for another many, many thousands of years. But of course, in the Ether, time is not really a factor. So things run in an order you don't expect, if there even is an order, which there is, but it runs weird. So you have like a bunch of different gods showing up and playing all these key roles, and we know barely anything about it because it's such a mess. But that being said, there are a few anecdotes about Khaine that exist that I think are worth tackling before we start talking more about like units and material world things, which generally speaking are much easier to discuss. So yeah, a couple of the really, really fun things about Khaine that are reinforced throughout especially 7th and 8th edition, which really dialed in heavy on the Elven gods and tried to make them feel like a very nice, cohesive pantheon. One of the most interesting things about Khaine is that Khaine is of the Elven gods. Khaine is he's a very powerful figure. I love Warhammer the War in Heaven, not to be confused with the War in Heaven and the War in yeah, exactly. God forbid GW use a different descriptor for something. one of the things that is very, very interesting about him is that he has the most interplay between the different gods. Where a lot of the gods in the Elven Pantheon get kind of treated as just like they live in their own little personal bubble and they don't like to interact. Khaine is completely different. He gets up in everybody's business. Where you have, like, there are stories about how Hekari and Authority, the goddess of magic and pleasure respectively, actively competed with one another trying to earn Khaine's affection. But Khaine is noted for being a god who has divine ADHD. He has a very short attention span, and he grows bored very quickly. So it's very difficult to maintain his favor for long, which is why you have to have so many crazy sacrifices. But so you have the story of them competing for his love. You have stories about all the times that Vol, who is enslaved to Khaine, who is practically chained to his anvil, producing different kinds of weapons for Khaine, does so without actively trying to rebel in any way, because Vol knows that Khaine will be needed to defeat the Dark Gods. Like, if it's going to happen, Khaine will be playing a key role. And
just to interrupt there, make sure we're I don't forget this point, because I will forget it. Because this is a classic Elven play. Marathi tells Malekith, for example, that the reason that she keeps Hellebron and all the rest of them around, thinking that they're in control and thinking that they're controlling her, is because she'll need them when they're going to war. And she doesn't want to destabilize what is a very powerful block. So she lets that block believe that they've got control and power when they do not. And this is a classic Elven play. Vol is doing exactly the same thing. So yeah, just worth interrupting just to make sure we got that one in place.
Yeah. Of the stories, Khaine forges for, Vol forges for Khaine a bunch of different things. There's a myth in there that exists in 40K as well as fantasy, but there's a story about how Vol forges 100 blades in a bargain to try and free Aisha from Khaine's grasp, but I think it's like 99 of the blades are flawed in some way.
99 of the blades are fine and one blade isn't.
Yeah, that's right. And Khaine perceives it. That's what it is. And Khaine gets pissed.
One of those blades is the Grieved, which I added to the Tome of Salvation. So there's actually one of the blades are out there somewhere in one of the books.
Yeah, so you have the 100 blades for Khaine that were forged by Vol, and many of them are supposedly hanging around the mortal world, as is Widowmaker. You have Widowmaker itself, which was not only forged by Vol, but was heated using the flames of Draupnir himself, who is the father of all dragons. And supposedly, because of the way Vol forged the blade and Draupnir participated in that forging, the fate of the dragons, of at least the Ulthwani dragons, that particular bloodline, is eternally bound to Khaine and bound to the elves themselves. So when Anarion drew the Widowmaker, he wasn't just dooming the elves, he also doomed the dragons of Ulthuan. Which adds another layer of tragedy and trauma to that, considering that Draupnir is, of course, the dragon that took him there, being the one of the most powerful sons of Draupnir. You also have the Rings of Khaine. So there's a story about how Khaine demanded a commission from Vol and Hekari, because he wanted to be able to control magic, because Khaine was not he could not wield the ether like some of the other gods could, and he desired to. So the two of them teamed up, and Vol forged 8 rings that went on each of Khaine's fingers and gave him complete and utter control over magic. But Hekari and Vol looked at each other and went, maybe this is a bad idea. So Hekari goes to her sister Authority, the goddess of pleasure, and whispers in her ears about these beautiful, glorious, godly, powerful rings that Khaine has. And Authority, being the goddess of pleasure, is a very jealous god, and she conspires to steal them for herself. And you may think that Authority, being a goddess of pleasure, surely she's not that scary. You'd be wrong. Authority's fucking terrifying, because she tries to seduce Khaine, which fails. And Khaine, we're talking about Khaine right now, is near the height of his power. He has 8 rings, allowing him to wield the winds of magic like he never has been able to before. Authority fights him, and she causes him to drop all 8 of his rings.
Bodies him.
she fleeces that fucker, which goes to show how scary she is. And the rings descend to the mortal plane, because apparently Khaine keeps leaving his shit everywhere in the material world. And one of them has been discovered by the High Elves, and it's a very, very powerful weapon.
Enormously powerful. And there's another 7 rings out there just waiting to be discovered by, I don't know, some Joan of Arc type figure.
Yeah, and that's assuming that there's truly only 8 rings. Maybe the elves only think there's 8 rings, but there could very well be more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you may say, wow, that's all kind of insane. Surely there's no feat that could top that. To which I say, no, there's one feat Khaine has accomplished that is truly mind-boggling, which is that I don't know if he does this in 40K. I assume he didn't, but in fantasy, during the War in Heaven, at it's the biggest moment, Khaine gets in a duel with Slaanesh. And against all odds, Khaine does lose. He is pushed back, but he wounds Slaanesh bad. Where Khaine takes up the Widowmaker and he cuts Slaanesh across the face, causing a permanent disfigurement to a god. So Slaanesh gets a big, nasty scar across his face that never heals. The god, Slaanesh, takes a permanent wound from that fucking sword.
So, there is a lot here to parse. And there are many more stories of elven gods as well. So don't think these are the only ones. But loosely, we have got ourselves Khaine, who, as has been pointed out, does center in a lot of the stories. And that's because Khaine is basically the figurehead deity for one entire faction in the Warhammer world. And that's the Dark Elves. So whenever someone says the Dark Elf gods are doing something, they generally say, so what's Khaine doing with that? Because he's such a central figure to the Dark Elves, because originally he was their only god, the only one. So he's always going to be central to everything that's described. And whenever they add new things, they're always adding it within the context of, well, before it was just Khaine, these other ones are there, and this is how they influence Khaine. So you can see why Khaine was central to all of those tales. But through all of those, we have ourselves definite facts. Number one, the war in heaven happened. This is a thing. It's a mythical set of events, arguably, but many of them have multiple real-world impacts, whether it's things like magical artifacts of those gods still existing, the literal sword of Khaine, which the fate of the world pretty much centers around, being there, and everyone being freaking terrified to even potentially consider touching it because of just how awful it will be. It's real. It is there. In the center of a massive battlefield that took place from a previous era. We have got ourselves the war in heaven. It happened. And this was a war between the gods. And we can say, as a fact, Khaine was against the Chaos gods. And the other gods were being used by Khaine to get success in that war, whether it was to gain extra weapons, extra artifacts, and you can begin to parse together what's happening. We have a god of war who's going to war with chaos, and other gods who are not necessarily supporting him in the way that he wants. And he cuts a freak because he's a child. And he is a freaking man baby the way he reacts. Consider him like a teenager, and I'm going to say that a lot for elves. Consider elves like hyper-emotional teenagers. And that's basically what Khaine is. He's an expression of elven, let's say, over-emotionality, which is one of the reasons why I think he probably is also super horny. It matches his description everywhere. He's a super horny war god. He has himself literally thousands of brides of Khaine, who are all his women, and also the only elves in the setting that are continually referred to, not just as beautiful and pale, all elves get that, but voluptuous. He turns them into titty elves, which is one hell of a statement to throw during a stream. But they're described as voluptuous in multiple places where they're not. Elves are generally not described as that anywhere else in the Warhammer world, where they're often described as androgynous, and it's difficult to see the men and the women are equally capable at fighting, equally capable of expressing. It's sometimes difficult for other species to even see the differences between them. But not witch elves. Witch elves are pretty much the epitome of all that is horny and all that is elf. And that is a really fun perspective when you consider his first bride. And his first bride was Morathi.
Yeah, so this is where we turn our attention to the mortal world. And things start to get really interesting really, really fast. Where Morathi, is going to have her own stream at some point, and it's going to be she might actually be a character we have to do in 2 parts.
Yeah, Morathi is so important while simultaneously sidelined by so many.
Yeah, so Morathi is a really difficult figure because a lot of the important parts of her life are shrouded in the midst of time before she meets an Aryan, where we know that she was a very, very gifted seer. She could see the future, and she could divine the ether in ways no one else could. And at some point in that mess, she encounters Khaine.
Yeah.
And also is captured by a Slaaneshi cult, and things happen, but it's confusing to say whether she was captured by accident or on purpose. But Morathi being Morathi, what we do know is 100%, beyond a shadow of a doubt, in some fashion, she encounters Khaine and impresses him to such a insane degree that he takes her on as a bride, which is something that 2 other gods, Authority, the goddess of pleasure, and Hakardi, the goddess of magic, have been actively vying for millennia and have failed. But Morathi does it.
And we have proof of this. This isn't just we're making supposition. We're not saying, this is something that might have happened because it makes sense within the setting. She is literally described as the first bride of Khaine in multiple places. She's also later on a bride of Azurin in multiple places. The 8th edition, the most recent one, says she married an Aryan. So that also happens. But back then, whatever she did when she first met him, she was given the cauldrons of blood. She got them from Khaine. And it's made quite clear in more than one place that is what occurred. She got them. She didn't grab them somehow. She got them, and she was the one that was spreading much of the Khaine worship through the vehicle of a pleasure cult. And this is one of the things that you must start double reading with, because often when you see the word pleasure cult, you immediately go Slaanesh. Morathi is much more complicated than that.
Yeah, so
it's more than just that.
Yeah, one thing that's worth saying here is that Morathi is really fun because the writers do often a really good job of not using God voice with her, but using in quite literally in the words of Morathi. So like if you read the Cauldrons of Blood entry in 8th edition, quite literally we'll talk about, she got the Cauldrons of Blood from Khaine. But it very specifically says that's what Morathi says, or so she claims. And the thing with Morathi is the pleasure cult can get a lot of people super confused, and it's really understandable because depending on which edition you look at, it takes very different forms. Or if you're like reading the Storm of Chaos book, you go, the Cult of Pleasure faction. You open it up, and it's Dark Elves with Demons of Slaanesh. And it's like, okay, so it's a Slaanesh thing. And then you look at like the Black Library books where it's like, no, it's just like she brings the Sithrai up to like a new level of worship that many of the elves are deeply uncomfortable with. And like, so all different authors have approached it different ways, but I think the best way to look at it is that all of them are technically true, because the thing about Morathi, and that's key to understand with Khaine and how she affects the worship of Khaine, is that Morathi will use whatever it takes to get the job done. And that would involve combining different elements of different, pulling what she wants from various gods, and that having a permanent impact on how that god is perceived and worshipped for all of elven kind.
Yeah, I'm going to say something that may be controversial to some, but given what we know of the timing, Morathi comes from a time from before the Chaos Gods were Chaos Gods. They were just gods. So they are not the same to her as they are to everybody else. The madness of the Chaos Gods and everything else, they're just a different group of gods. They would become the Chaos Gods, that much is certain. But she was there, present during the Great War when the Cataclysm comes and the Chaos Gods tried to destroy the world. But the Chaos Gods were a term that came to be at that point. She was there when it was a thing. So I would argue that she and the great pleasure cults that she uses, Slaanesh is just one part of a far greater whole, and that she is also the most powerful sorceress the Dark Elves pretty much have. And that comes hand in hand with many of the pacts that she's made with various deities. It's said that the Dark Elves as a whole, and even in 8th edition, they mentioned this, that they use pacts to empower themselves. And pacts are etheric entities. They are making deals with demons. And that is something that is beyond the pale for the vast majority of the Warhammer world. But the Dark Elves are not just arrogant in this regard. They actually think themselves to be in control of this completely. Now, you could argue they're not. You could argue they are. It doesn't really matter what you argue. What matters is, what do the Dark Elves themselves believe? Now, different writers have got a different approach to this. Take, for example, Gav Thorpe. Gav Thorpe is very much in the Morathi is just a Slaanesh agent, and she knows it, and that's it. It's that simple. She is a manifestation of Slaanesh.
Yeah,
very much. And if you go to the original writers who were writing all the way back in, say, the 4th edition of the book, very much Morathi was pitched as the Slaanesh attempt to bring down Inarian afterwards. Although when you actually look at what happens through the course of the Dark Elf Army list, the exact opposite is the case. None of her actions support that at all. But that's how they sort of picture. However, other writers just haven't. And they very much made her a far more complicated character. And I'm going to argue that Gav, bless him, I speak with Gav frequently. Gav, who both says she is this, also says other things with the things that he has written, which gives us a far deeper, more complicated picture. Although it's worth noting that in the 6th edition army list, it is very clear that Slaanesh and the Cult of Pleasure are pretty much intrinsically linked. But that gets significantly eroded later in the later editions.
Yeah, this is one of those things where the editions change dramatically, because if you go into 8th edition, the Cult of Khaine is used by Malekith to eradicate the Pleasure Cult, where the Pleasure Cult is seen as a chaos cult. So Malekith weaponizes the Cult of Khaine into tracking down and assassinating and murdering all of these people that worship gods that Malekith does not approve of, or use methods that Malekith does not approve of. Because, quite frankly, there's no one more anti-chaos in the setting than Malekith is. He's just like, where you could argue, like, argue Morathi's like, I'll use whatever it takes to win. Malekith tends to be much more on, I'll use whatever it takes, unless it's that chaos garbage, in which case I'm going to stab it 1,000 times in the throat.
I would argue that that's not necessarily the case. I would argue more that if it's out of control, he will stab it 1,000 times in the throat.
Much less tolerant.
Yes, absolutely. Where Morathi is far more, oh, they've fallen, have they? Well, I can use that. And they've fallen, I can use them too. And they've fallen, I can use all of them. Morathi is far more manipulative, arguably, than her son. And also, one of the fun things, just before we go off on Morathi, I really enjoyed one of the details inside the 6th edition, because it's one of the rare examples where Malekith takes his helmet off. And you get a description of what Malekith looks like underneath, which is pretty cool. That's in 6th edition army list if you want to go check it out.
The last thing that I'll say about Morathi that's really interesting is seeing the game's direction, of course, Games Workshop has taken her in, where, of course, as it evolved into Age of Sigmar, she quite literally became the Khainite character. She is literally Khaine reborn, and even takes what's left of his divinity and uses it to ascend herself up to divinity, where she is now Morathi Khaine, instead of simply being Morathi, which is a pretty interesting evolution for the character. And
it makes sense as well, if you consider that. She was the Bride of Khaine, the very first Bride of Khaine. She establishes the Witch Elves. She gives them the Cauldrons of Blood. She gives the hags their eternal life. She gives them their eternal youth and voluptuousness. that is so pleasing, pardon me, to Khaine.
What's the first place we get as Khainites? Bigger boobs. There we go.
She established the pleasure cults that were focused on the sacrifice and the bloodshed that was central to Khainite worship in the early days of Nagaroth as well. She effectively created what we know of as Khaine worship inside the boundaries of the Dark Elves, and then gave it to her son and said, Malekith, I now want you to be Khaine. You are now going to be at the center of all of this cult. She is an arch manipulator, and she archly manipulated them all and gave Malekith everything he needed to completely control his rebellious elves, who are basically a bunch of overwrought teenagers who are really upset because they failed to bring down the vortex. And we end up getting ourselves a very strong and, over the course of the centuries after that, very empowered Dark Elf group that, because of their very dark nature, for want of a better description, really thrive. Their cities expand, their slave trade boosts them beyond anything that they would have had if they'd been the far more gentler version that they could have been if they'd followed the more high elf model.
Yep. All right, we're going to get caught up on Super Chat stuff, and then we're going to dive into some other characters revolving around the god, and the god himself, of course. Krimgelto said, "What if I wore all masks of Khaine and drew the sword? I feel like you just explode."
Thanks, Krimgelto. Also, screw Krimgelto.
Watchdog 3079. So, do you think there's a Khaine equivalent to the Path of Shadows? If so, how would it look if elemental with? Yeah, that's all. Yeah. So I will say, one of my favorite aspects of the LAWhammer verse. You're on this side. The LAWhammer verse. From Andy's continuing iterations on the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay game is the path system for the elves, because it makes a ton of sense and is what the army books reinforce, just never really explored very well, where you have like this whole thing about how like swordmasters are exploring the path of Hoeth and will do so for centuries before they even consider doing anything else. And it's the same for pretty much all the different, like, the Scissors of Slaughter are just on the path of Eldrasor. And a lot of your wizards are on the path of either, your sorceresses are on the path of Hakardi, or your archmages are on the path of either Hoeth or Lilith, depending on certain circumstances. And it's like, that makes so much sense. But the answer is yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love Warhammer. It really needs a new name, because if you say that, like, you're gonna have people going like, wait, are you talking about like the time with the old ones and the Necrons, or are you talking about the time with the Slanesh being born, or are you talking about the fantasy version? Like, it gets very messy. One ring to rule them all, to bind them in blood and madness. Luckily, Khaine's rings don't seem to do that in particular, at least the ones they found so far. Maybe one of his, maybe he had a ring that went somewhere else that did that. Who can say? The ultimate expression of divine power. Yes, truly. Khaine equals corn. Sixes and witch elves have the skull root of corn on their helmets, after all. Yeah, so that is something I think actually worth addressing real quick for a minute, is that one of the things in universe that is in-universe is fun and very confusing, but in outside of the universe can get kind of hilarious, because different writers have genuinely believed that, and there's been misconceptions about that. Oh, Khaine is simply a manifestation of corn, or a different aspect of corn. Like, I'll tell you, I won't say who they are just because it's not my story to tell, but I can tell you that there are at least 2 writers I know of who quite literally operated on the belief that all gods in Warhammer are simply different aspects of the 4 chaos gods. And that's it. So, like, the 4 chaos gods are the only gods in existence, and every other god is simply a misunderstanding or a different aspect of those gods. I think that's a terrible idea, and I hate that version, but those people have written significant amounts of lore, so there are books where you'll find really confusing information that suggests that.
So this is definitely the case. I have been told to write to that line in the past, and I have argued very hard against it. Not just simply because it lessens the Warhammer world and its depth and its quality as a whole, and in some respects just drags it towards yet another, all the Chaos Gods, they done killed every other type of god out there, 40k-ish nonsense. The Warhammer world has always been different, but it also contradicts such a vast swathe of the, not just lore, but the various stories and what now comes later in Age of Sigmar, where it quite literally can't be the case. Even if you just ignore Age of Sigmar and everything that happens in it, like I broadly do. And I certainly don't use Age of Sigmar as a source or an inspiration for anything that happens in Warhammer to any great degree, because it's always going to be there being its own thing. That whole setting completely rubbishes the idea that the four great powers of chaos are the only thing that's out there. Completely destroys it. Nevertheless, it is a core component of how many writers write because they believed it was the case, or hinted at because they wanted it to be the case. When I was doing, for example, the Tome of Salvation about 20 years ago, when I was writing that book for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, the writing team, when we sat down discussing that, there was one who wanted that to be the case, and I blankly refused it. Bluntly, and hardly did it. There was no way I was going to write Sigmar as a chaos god, more as a chaos god. Just wasn't going to happen. But I was happy to hint at it. I was happy to say that particularly the chaos gods and their worshippers might believe that, because that would be a core belief within the world. So some parts that I added to that book did indeed hint to it all being chaos, because that's something that feels correct for the world. Absolutely correct for the world. So I have no issue with it being an in-game belief. I have a lot of issue with it being actually the case, because it just lessens the setting as a whole, in my eyes at least.
Yeah, and I think this is actually a good moment as well to point out some for those that are like, oh, I don't understand what the difference between them is. One of my favorite explorations that some characters in universe have explained between like Khorne and Khaine is that one of the things about Khaine is that, and Andy kind of said this earlier with the intro, is that Khaine is not a god that appreciates just like wanton, lazy savagery. Khaine, one of my favorite things about him, especially the way he's expressed in later editions, is that Khaine, when it comes to death and murder and violence, Khaine appreciates art. That murder is an expression. It is a way to express some very deep core philosophies. And the other thing is that, like I said earlier, Khaine is rather amusingly portrayed as having some of the most severe ADHD I've ever seen among a deity in the Warhammer world, where it quite literally talks about that for the Dark Elves. They come up with ever more elaborate and profane or beautiful ways of murder to get Khaine's attention, to do something he's never seen before to earn his favor, because his favor is fleeting, because he loses focus and gets drawn by someone else somewhere else. But a lot of the things you'll see with Khaine that are really fun is that, and the Witch Elves in particular talk about this in a lot of really fun short stories and Black Library novels, is it's not about just killing. It's about how you kill, how beautiful you can make death.
Yeah, the number of times they will say something like Khaine will be pleased with this because a particular poison or a particular death was done with such often savagery or horror or extreme result, because Khaine is interested in the extremes. And it's not just the extremes that Khaine himself pursues, because he is angry, massively angry, ferocious, warlike, murderous deity who resolves his problems by killing shit. But he doesn't just kill shit. And I'm going to give one nice, clean example of a major difference. For Khaine, you get Death Night, one night of wanton abandon. For Khorne, every day's Death Night. Every single fucking day is Death Night. But for Khaine, it's about expressing the extreme in exclusion. If all you do is extreme, none of it is extreme. Because he is also about appreciating the finer side. And this is the bit of Khaine that very poorly gets written. The elves live in extraordinary wealth, extraordinary splendor, and that includes the Dark Elves. They are in a state of absolute marvelous surroundings, and that is because they have their contrasts. And that comes at the cost of the extreme pain that they inflict. You can't appreciate one unless you are afraid of the other coming. And you can't really be afraid of it unless it is expressed. And Khaine is all about keeping everyone grounded. And in many respects, I will argue this, and this may come again as a surprise for the people who like Khaine being Khorne. He's quite literally anti-Khorne, because Khorne is all about hammering away at it all the time, all the time, all the time, never stopping. Khorne cares not from whence the blood flows, murder, slaughter, mayhem, where Khaine is all about putting the contrasts in place so that you never lose yourself to that. And you are always aware of it, you are always scared of it, and you never, ever just do that, because Dark Elves, at their heart, and the various people that they're with, are terrified. Absolutely terrified of Khaine. Terrified of him.
Yeah, completely. Like one of the strictures of his worship is that, like, you cannot kill unless it's Death Knight. You cannot deal meaningless death. It always has to be an art. And
Death Knight's not meaningless.
Well, yeah, it does have a point. Like, that's the one night where you're allowed to kill messily, so to speak. Because, like, if you just are lazily killing people, or you're not performing murder as this art, Khaine quite literally get angry enough to smite your ass.
Yeah, that doesn't sound fun, does it?
No.
Although, given what we know of how the gods work, it'd be far more likely that you'd get a visit from his various brides.
Yeah.
Or worse, one of his assassins. We haven't even touched his assassins yet.
We're going to start talking about
the executioners.
Actual physical cult here in a moment. Barnes, I find it very interesting. Khaine shapes women into a desirable form, while the ancient widow takes attractive, desirable women and turns them into hideous hags, robbing Khaine of that which pleases him. That's a fun theory.
I like that more than I expected to. When I first heard it, I was like, particularly because both of those are things that I have expressly written into the setting myself at various points. I actually really quite like that. The more we do our streams, the more it makes me want to start writing something to connect the two inside my game. God damn it.
Yeah, that I will say, that's a compelling argument, Barnes. That's a very compelling argument.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
What the Ancient Widow's doing. I quite like that. That's a good one. Thanks. Thanks for that one.
How much sacrifice is connected to Khaine? Is there any reference to empowering Khorne? So, one of the things that I think is a trap to fall into in Warhammer Fantasy that I cannot encourage you enough to avoid is very, very, very rarely, so rarely, I don't really think it really bears mentioning, is there a thing you can do in the Warhammer universe that will make one god happy and nobody else? That's not how it works. When Tehenowin is massacring hundreds of thousands of Skaven for Sotek, he is also exalting Khorne. When you are unleashing magic to obliterate the demons of Tzeentch, you are also exalting Tzeentch. When you are making a piece of art to celebrate, when you are making a perfect weapon to celebrate your worship of Vol, you are also exalting Slaanesh. Like, the gods bleed over into each other's domains like crazy. But it's not a flaw, it's the rule.
And with elves, their gods actually exist. So let's not do the 40k thing and go, all their gods are dead, it doesn't really matter, blah, blah, blah. They are not. They exist. There are these deities out there. And if you do what, say, for example, the assassins do, it's clearly written in multiple places, including the most recent army list, that the and Seventh said it a bit more heavily, as I recall. The assassins emulate Khaine directly. And they do that with pretty much all of their expressions. And the reason they do that is because, you could argue, they definitely aren't being Khorne. They can't be. And part of the Death Knight, let's say, worship cycle is murder, excess, then fucking. They're not Khorne. They're just not. They're doing different things. They are expressing themselves in different ways. Now, there might be lots of blood being shed. There might be lots of horror. But, and I think this is the bit that most people forget, elves can fall to chaos too. Now, there is nothing saying that some of these witch elves who believe they're entirely dedicated to one thing could not be led astray by an elf that has fallen to Khorne. Absolutely could occur. A cult could become wrong. It could turn into a blood cult rather than necessarily a Khaine cult. Now, you might argue that they lie close to each other, but from my view, at least, when I look at everything that they're doing, it is so anti-Khorne that it's difficult to express just how much it's so far away from what Khorne believes. Nevertheless, I could see it could be very easily turned into a Khorne cult.
Yeah. Let's see. I wonder if a character pulled the Total War move, don the Nemesis crown, and draw the Sword of Khaine. You would definitely explode. Yeah, you would just blow up.
I'm because obviously I've been struggling with my connections in here and getting everything ready. You may notice I'm in a completely different place, as I said earlier in the stream, than I was last week. Last week I was about a whole meter and a half in that direction. I'm in a very different place just now. But I've been playing around with Total War, and every time it says such and such has drawn the Sword of Khaine, I'm like, are they dead? Because they're probably going to be dead.
But by the way, fun random fact about the Widowmaker, something really funny that Games Workshop did that was genuinely interesting for a lore person myself, but kind of just came out of left field is Games Workshop was after Warhammer Fantasy had died, and they were talking about something Age of Sigmar related. But for some reason, Games Workshop put out a post on their community page where they randomly answered a lore question, which they almost never do. And they came out and quite literally said that the Widowmaker, according to Games Workshop, is canonically the most powerful weapon in the setting of Warhammer Fantasy. Like, even Galmaraz is not Widowmaker. Widowmaker is the top.
And I would argue that is true. This is, whenever I've been working on stuff, it has always been the one. And the reason that I would argue that is true is because if a greater demon is afraid not to be hit by Widowmaker, they're obviously going to be afraid of that because it could kill them. It's a nasty weapon. And there's always God killing things out there. But to pick it up because of what it might do to them.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what sets Widowmaker apart and makes it so that it feels good being the most powerful weapon, is that so many characters have looked at that blade and gone, no. Yeah. One of the most famous moments of Malekith as a character is when he finally gets to the Sword of Khaine, sees the scepter, and still goes, no, absolutely not.
No. And indeed, some of the battles across the editions that are held over in the Blighted Isle are for control of the Blighted Isle to make sure the other side doesn't draw it, to show just how much they don't want to draw it. It has nothing to do at all with trying to claim the weapon so they can draw it. The Dark Elves want to hold it so that none of the High Elves dare draw it, and the High Elves want to hold it so the Dark Elves don't do it, because they're both afraid that the other side will do it and doom everything.
Yep. So I managed to see a bit of live after all. This is a super fantastic topic. I always look forward to you guys. I'm sure Khaine has many dark deeds. Yes, he does. And make sure you pick up dark deeds if you haven't already. Hawk, if you want to spam those links, I appreciate it. Thank you. Nightbringer, the only Chaos to be explained in lore is a lie. That is a fun manipulation you see by certain characters. If you read like the Liber Chaotica, the Alphonse something. The Celesti cultist is actively trying to convince the reader that all of the gods are merely the chaos gods.
Absolutely. And that's actually one of the, because I remember speaking, because Marianne, who wrote that, he and I did quite a lot of chatting back in the mid 2000s. And I was at that point, he'd recently been writing the Realms of Sorcery book, and I was working on the Tome of Salvation book. And I largely called bullshit on those lines, to which he agreed. And he said, yeah, of course they're bullshit. Because these are coming from in-character sources, and they absolutely believe this is the case and want others to believe it too, to vindicate and validate their own self-expression and their own beliefs. You know what it's like when you think that something's true and somebody contradicts it. Your first thought is, no, I'm right. I'm now going to argue it out. Excuse me. I'm right. And the Chaos Worshippers have got so much wrapped up in their beliefs that it is almost essential for them to share, make others believe it too. But as we've already said, the idea that it is true is exceedingly unlikely. For all, some writers not only believe it's true, write it as the truth pretty much in everything that they do.
Yeah, and I would actually say that this theory in universe I really love, because I genuinely believe that this is the theory that drives Archaon insane, because he comes to believe it. And this is what sets Archaon off on the path to become Archaon, which in the end times, that's also the narrative they run with, where when he finally is confronted with Sigmar at the end times, Archaon can't bring himself to believe that Sigmar is real, even when he's fighting him. And that is what leads to Archaon's defeat, even though the world ends up blowing up.
It's a funny old name.
It is the thing. In opposition to Khorne, does Khaine show any particular favor to spellcasters? Khaine does not hate spellcasters. I mean, consider Marathi is one of his favored. Khaine, the sorceresses can deal murder just as beautifully and wildly as someone with a blade. Now, Khaine prefers for you to do it yourself with blade in hand. There is something more intimate about that, and Khaine does like the intimacy.
Yeah, he does.
But there are spells that emulate Khaine. Fury of Khaine is a very famous spell that even the High Elves unleash.
Yeah, so Khaine is an integral part of all elves, and magic is an integral part of elves. Khaine himself wished to be a better spellcaster in turn. Does he show any particular favor? No more than he favors any other elves, and elves are by their very nature intrinsically magic. So the answer is no, but yes.
Yeah, compared to Khorne, yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the god of sex, death, and rock and roll on one night a year, yes.
Although I'd argue that sex, death, and rock and roll is very closely into Authorities territory. But we are really dealing with the underworld gods as a whole, and the underworld gods as a whole are largely the gods of sex, death, and rock and roll anyway. Khaine is just one of a pantheon of gods who have chosen a particular way of expressing themselves, and that tends to be at the extreme of the darker side of elven emotions.
Does Hilariel have a corrupted advisor or show as a high elf view of Khaine as she draws so it's basically a Gandhi situation from Civilization where the Hilariel AI is so close to the sword of Khaine that she always speed draws it, even though
damn freaking straight. It's happened 3 times to me already.
Yeah, she loves that fucking thing in Total War.
Yeah, so true. She's just sitting there going, it's mine, precious.
Would the Widowmaker shatter Galmaraz like Mjolnir? I think it would probably depend on a lot of circumstances.
So I think there is certainly something here to discuss. And I don't want to get into it because it's not this stream. But I will say that Galmaraz, as written, is not all that. But it becomes all that because of the nature of what happens at the end of the Warhammer world. By comparison, Widowmaker already was all that. Already is. And arguably more. So Galmaraz, as Karl Franz wielded it, if it got struck by Widowmaker, I'm not guaranteeing those runes are going to survive it, because it's going to be bad. This is a powerful, most powerful weapon. But after the end of the world and what becomes Age of Sigmar afterwards, then Galmaraz becomes more because of the very nature of how these things work. So after that, who knows? But I would suggest that before the end times, Galmaraz is just an artifact amongst hundreds. An arguably powerful, very powerful artifact, but not all that special. It becomes special, where Widowmaker already is.
Yeah, Galmaraz, the best way I could explain it is that in Warhammer Fantasy, whether you like it or not, it's pretty canonical that Galmaraz is evolving over the course of the setting and becoming something more than it was, which opens a lot of really spooky questions that are also really fun questions, whereas Widowmaker has already finished that evolution, so to speak. It's fully evolved.
I'll give you one example of that. I can actually give you a canonical example of why there is a problem here. And it's actually, not to put any spoilers out there, but it is one of the core plot points of our version of The Enemy Within. And that's that just take a look at Galmaraz. Have a moment and take a look at it. And some of the symbology it's on it. Some of that symbology did not exist when that hammer was made.
Yeah. You know that dwarf forged weapon made by potentially an ancestor god or some ancient runesmith? Why is that Imperial Cross on there, guys?
Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't made for the Empire. It just wasn't.
All right. Okay, this is the last super chat I'm going to look at before we move on to some other topics, just so we make sure we actually get through everything. This feels very dwarf. Elgi can't tell the living god from a chaos god. You shan't be saying otherwise, laddies, lest the bloody Elgi skent the pair of you anyway.
No,
dwarves be like, look at all this god nonsense. So one of the things that's really interesting, so a character that two characters that we should touch on, actually probably three characters, we should touch on very, very quickly before talking about kind of more of the broad units and expressions of Khaine, because they open up some really fun things. Are, of course, Hellebron, Thalar's Dreadbringer, and Shadowblade, who kind of are a little trio.
Yes.
In that they are the cult of Khaine for the most part, as far as like the modern Warhammer world is concerned. Hellebron is a very interesting character when you look at Khaine because of her relationship with Morathi and Morathi's relationship with Khaine. Because obviously Hellebron and Morathi have a intense hatred and rivalry with one another. Like, they fucking despise one another and are constantly trying to screw with one another. And Hellebron tends to lose more than she wins by quite a bit, but, you know, she keeps fighting the good fight. However, Hellebron is not a complete dupe by any means of the imagination. And there is some really sinister things about her. One of my favorite short stories is there's a short story you could pick up. I can't remember the name of it, but I know it's on the Black Library website, that talks about Hellebron's origins. So you get to see Hellebron during before the War of Vengeance. So because she was born in the Elven colonies, and she loves Morathi, like, wants to be one of Morathi's handmaidens more than anything in the world. And their relationship is not super important for this stream, other than to say it doesn't go well. But when Hellebron is kind of cast out by Morathi and shamed by Morathi because Morathi sees her as a potential threat, one of the things that happens,
tool.
Yeah. And one of the things that happens is that Hellebron does something very, very cool within the story, which is that within the colony she's in, Khaine worship is normal. The Sundering hasn't happened yet, so the elves don't have the huge butthurt about like certain gods being like, oh, like we don't talk as much about these ones versus these ones. They had a more holistic approach to the pantheon, and they had a priest of Khaine who had what the elves had always had as worship of Khaine. But Hellebron decides to make the worship of Khaine her identity. Her and I believe her sister as well. And what she does is that she takes the worship of Khaine in a very different direction than what had been seen prior by elves. Yeah, thank you. The Bloody Handed story. Bloody Handed is the name of the short story. Compared to what had used to been the case. Because so once again, we're not talking about high elves, dark elves, or wood elves. This is before that. They were just elves. Just elves. And the elves had a more balanced approach to Khaine, where they didn't shun him as much as the high elves, but Khaine was something to be emulated in the appropriate time. He was meant for war and war alone, where Hellebron became essentially an addict. And started and was one of the earliest examples of a witch elf, as we understand them now, where she stripped herself essentially naked. And instead of relying upon armor, one of the reasons a lot of people look at witch elves and look at the nakedness and go like, why? And there's an actual reason for it, other than, you know, just people being like, oh, the sexy.
Horny.
Yeah. The thing about, and what you learn in the Hellebron story is that in order to properly exult in the experience of murder, Hellebron does everything she can to essentially heighten the sensory experience of violence and death, meaning you don't wear any armor because you want to feel the blood of your enemies, the hot blood of your enemies against your skin. You want to feel the wind that you're just like, it's basically like taking Molly and having a super sensory experience of taking everything you could feel, see, smell, and driving it to a higher level, which is why witch elves canonically drug themselves up before they go onto the battlefield. It's to heighten their senses. That way you can feel every iota of that experience, which allows them to do crazy things like they're dodging blades and moving aside and avoiding things that they have no right to be avoiding, even with elven speed.
They're elves. They're elves who are high as a kite with heightened sensations all over the place, and also desperate to show themselves before Khaine that they are perfect examples to be his bride. They don't really care if they die because they'll go to his side in their own heads. And the danger is a core component of what they're doing. So, yeah, your favorite drugged elf witchy people.
Yeah, and she ends up ritually sacrificing and murdering the Khaine priest who tries to stop them because he looks at this and goes, this is a problem. This is not appropriate for the way we approach the entire pantheon as opposed to just emulating Khaine. And Hellebrand takes it completely overboard. And if you read between the lines, although Morathi's let's say relationship with Hellebrand has a lot of spite and envy involved, you could very well argue that she does a brilliant job of manipulating Hellebrand into taking the cult of Khaine in exactly the direction that Morathi wants it to go in.
100%. Yeah, and agreed completely. Generally speaking, because Morathi has been written by multiple different authors, she's a hard person to pin down because the authors have pinned her to different places. But we know what her overall character is, and we can judge her by her deeds, if not necessarily by the individual actions that are laid out. And her overall deeds are this. Every single thing that you see that happens, you should basically say, it's better what Morathi wanted behind the scenes. And the second you see that, and you see her for what she is, you go, right, gotcha. Now I know why the Dark Elves are the way the Dark Elves are. Now I know why they are worshipping the way they're worshipping, doing what they're doing. Because almost everything, when you look at it, comes about because of her. And Malekith is riding that. He's fully aware of what she's capable of and who she is and what she is. And is, just take a look at some of the stories, is still her son. And is shaping Dark Elves for what he needs. And they are entirely shaped. And that includes the cult of Khaine as it expresses within the Dark Elf, let's say, what, they're not kingdoms, the Dark Elf what? Realms? That'll do.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
The Dread Lordships.
Yeah, I will say that, Morathi is definitely one of those characters that, like, I think in all of her, like, borderline 8 to 10,000 years of existence, she's only, like, truly lost or been outwitted, like, 5 or 6 times, maybe, which is a pretty impressive track record.
Totally is. And she's going to win. Just take a look what happens in Age of Sigmar. Continues. She wins.
She does. That being said, turning back to, so we have Hellebrand in the Witch Elves, where you have this very sensational, orgiastic experience to the extent, like, I remember there's a story in the 6th edition book where you literally get an in-person perspective of one of the victims to a sacrifice to Khaine, and it's this really over-the-top, pretty grimdark scene of this witch elf quite literally having sex with this man on a ritual altar. Yeah, and as they reach climax, she murders him. Like, she slits his throat right as they climax as part of this experience and offering to Khaine, which, once again, it's about this sensory experience. But that's not all Khaine is, because on the other flip side, leaning much less into, like, the extreme feeling of emotion and, like, getting really intense with it, you have the Hargoneth Executioners. And the Hargoneth Executioners are perfectionists. These are individuals that, instead of exalting Khaine by losing yourself to sensation, by throwing yourself into battle basically naked to experience everything and to feel the blood flowing over your skin and to achieve murder through just, like, the most impressive displays of acrobatics and all the a more frenzied style, they're precise. These are experts in decapitation, where to them, decapitation is the art. It's about getting the perfect blow, where it's considered, they practice day after day after day on sacrifices and slaves and enemies to learn how to execute the most beautiful artistic strike with their two-handed Dryax in a single blow. Like, to not get a perfect kill with their weapon is deeply embarrassing. And it's not only embarrassing, it's an affront to their god.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, the Hargoneth Executioners offer a very different version of Khaine worship while simultaneously showing that the undercurrents are similar. And those undercurrents are that one takes the killing to an extreme. But that extreme is not for bloodshed alone. That extreme then moves towards the pleasure in a job well done and doing it correct. And sometimes that exaltation comes with classic over-the-top elven craziness. But it's a very anti-Khorne way of dealing with it. Now, that often leaves people going, well, it's just Slaanesh then, isn't it? And you're like, no, it's not, because they are so deeply in on a different aspect of it. All you're doing is you're focusing on individual sections and saying that bit is like this or that bit is like that. And you know what? If you wish to do that, then every army that goes to war is basically just Khorne, isn't it? And then you start falling back in, well, there's just 4 Chaos Gods and all the rest are dead. No, that's not the case for elves. They are emulating Khaine. They are being like Khaine, that over-the-top character that Khaine is. And through that emulation, you could argue that they are further away from the Chaos Gods than any others because of that. But that does not make them good guys. In fact, in many respects, it's the exact opposite. It makes them what would be, by any general moral measure by most species in the Warhammer world, utterly horrific, truly awful, terrible people that you should be rightly terrified of, which is exactly how all the elves think of Khaine. The other gods think of Khaine like this. When Khaine comes to them and says, make me 8 rings of magic because I want them, their first thought isn't, yeah, that's probably a bad idea because Khaine with that would be bad. It's, oh, shit, Khaine's scary. Fuck.
Yeah.
Fuck.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to do this. Shit.
Yeah. One of the big reasons Kurnos and Aisha flee to the mortal world isn't because of like the Chaos Gods. It's because of Khaine. They're getting away from Khaine.
Khaine. And that's assuming that, you know, that even actually happens given Isha is also captured.
Yeah.
By Nurgle.
Well, no. It's Shalia in the fantasy universe.
Yeah, depending upon how you look at it.
Yeah, my Pox Fulcrum is Shalia. I like that story. Anyway, but it gives us another degree of separation from 40K, and I always appreciate those. Yep. One of the things that is so talking about the Hargoneth Executioners, this of course leads to the discussion of the Hargoneth Executioner, Talaris Dreadbringer. Talaris is a very, very interesting figure. Because one of the things you'll have noticed is that for the most part, when talking about Khaine, we've been talking about the ladies, the brides of Khaine, which make up the significant majority of the cult. But then you have your Hargoneth Executioners, which don't have a gender dedication. They are whoever is willing to take up the blade and not fuck it up. And then we have the Assassins, who we'll talk about in a little bit, which are actually purely men, according to more sources.
Yeah, pretty much, because they're trained by the good old brides of Khaine as well.
Yeah, but Talaris is a very fascinating figure because Talaris, uniquely among the worshippers of Khaine, claims and seems to quite literally hear the voice of Khaine in his head, where Khaine is talking to him, whispering to him, telling him things, telling him where he needs to go, who he needs to kill. And he's not, it's not just, he is kind of insane, to be frank, but he's not just insane. He has found things that he should not have been able to find. He knows where Khaine's artifacts are. One of the big campaigns that he's involved with in 8th edition is his blood voyages. And the most notable of which is that Hellebrand and Talaris go off on this big invasion where they attack like Bretonnia or the Empire or something, and they kill a bunch of people and they capture a bunch of slaves, and everybody leaves except Talaris, where Talaris says, no, Khaine tells me I'm not done yet. And a bunch of other worshippers of Khaine go, oh, well, Talaris can hear the voice of Khaine, so we're going to stay with him. And Hellebrand's like, all right, well, fine, I'm leaving. So they all leave, and Talaris leads a campaign down into Nehakara and fights against the Tomb Kings, and hilariously enough, gets his entire army massacred. But he finds this incredibly powerful relic of Khaine that had been lost millennia ago in the sands of the lands of the dead. And he finds it, and Khaine tells him, good job, go home. And alone, he goes back. Because to him, he says, well, all of these Druki who will die will make an exceptional offering to Khaine, and may they die well. And he just marches off into the desert and makes his way back to Nagaroth because Khaine is with him. And he's a pretty spooky guy. And one thing that's actually really notable, leaning into the Brides of Khaine concept, is that Talaris fucks around big time. But him and Hellebrand are like,
he's an elf, you know.
I will say the funniest fucking thing to me is that there's a Death Knight short story about Hellebrand that talks about how one of Hellebrand's her schedule, so to speak, is that she reaches a certain point of the year where she becomes so crone-like and horrible that she's like not only super hideous, but her like bones are breaking and like she's just bad. She's in a bad way. And so she doesn't like anyone being around her. But on Death Knight, when she goes into the cauldron, she merges back as her buxom self. The first thing she does every year is her and Talaris have like insane, wild, crazy murder sex every year on the dot.
Thanks, Murder Knight.
And Talaris is always like, there's a scene where you get Talaris's perspective, and he's just kind of like, oh, it's that time. I gotta hurry. I gotta go. I got a place to be. My girlfriend's gonna kill me if I'm not there on time.
I particularly like him as a character because when he first was added to the game, which is all the way back in 1993, he was just an expression of the Hargoneth executioners, basically a captain. That was pretty much it. But as he's developed over each iteration, over each one of the various generations of Warhammer, he's just been added to and added to and added to until eventually he is effectively almost an avatar of Khaine himself, which is wonderful for the politics that they were building up, because that would make him stand directly against, and I do mean directly against, the Witch King himself, who claims to be that, and he isn't. Expressly is not. He claims it, 100% claims it, but he isn't. In truth, if you want to go with the actual what he most likely is, he is a half avatar of Ajuran to be, because of what went on in the flame, and he denied, threw himself out from, chickened out of, refused to accept, whatever you want to go with, whatever goes on in his head. There's different versions of it. But on the other side, Khaine has clearly chosen someone in game, and I like that. And it would have been lovely to see that taken to its ultimate end and to have had a proper challenge, because nothing challenges the Witch King. Nothing. I mean, he's one of those figures that's a bit like Superman, where you're like, yeah, but he's Superman.
Yeah, that was one of the big buildups in 8th edition that we didn't get to see resolved. That would have been so nice, was that the Cult of Khaine was slipping out of the control of Malekith and debatably Morathi, though you could always argue maybe Morathi planned for it all along. But Hellebrand knows about Talaris and knows that he hears the voices. That's why she's so close to him. Yeah. And Talaris is actively opposed to Malekith, because the voice in him is saying, he's a liar, he's a heretic. And Talaris is like, yes. And Hellebrand is biding her time, and she's training up Shadowblade, which leads, of course, into our assassin discussion. After we talk about assassins, we'll get back to super chats real quick. But assassins are super fucking fascinating, because when you hear assassin, you may just think, oh, they're just Dark Elf assassins. But no, they have a really fascinating background, which is that usually on Death Knight, not always, but usually, Witch Elves will go around and like catch anybody they can to murder. However, if they find infant boys, if they find infant girls, they'll usually just take them into the cult. But if they find infant boys, they are basically put into a very special training program where No,
it's worse than that. They're thrown into the cauldron of blood, and any that survive go into the special training program. Don't forget the cauldron of blood.
The initiation part.
And most of them obviously don't survive that, because, hey, they're Dark Elves. If there isn't at least a little bit of horror, murdering babies, why are we even doing it? So let's murder our babies first, and any that somehow get away from the baby murder, they're the ones that are going to be the assassins to be.
I forgot they have we got a whole bunch of new babies. Wait. We got to see if they make it through the baptism first.
Yeah, the baptism of blood. It's truly horrific. But as we all know, babies can swim anyway if you drop them in. And what's the difference? You ever
see those like videos of like swim teachers where they just throw the baby? So it's just blood. They're like, Shuck.
Lob. So yeah, Death Knight is pretty freaking horrible, and the witch elves are out looking for babies, elven children that they can get their hands on to basically sacrifice to Khaine. And those that survive that particular sacrificial ritual are the ones that get taken in as the assassins to be. And don't just simply think, oh, that's it, they've got it easy now, they're going to get trained as assassins, it'll be fine. It's hell. Most of them die. In fact, it's fair to say that a lot of Dark Elf training involves most of them dying. So don't think this is somehow particularly extreme, but actually it is. Take your typical, most of them die, it's extreme Dark Elf training, and then times that by 10. Because the Dark Elf assassins that get created by the end of this are all extraordinary. They are quite literally the sort of thing that would walk up to almost any character in the game and go, yeah, sorry, you're dead now. Their stats in game are mental, actually ridiculous, particularly when you look at someone like the man himself.
Yeah, I'm always I also have initiative 10 because fuck you.
Yeah, totally. There is nothing faster than them in the game. Nothing can go faster than them. They are going to hit you. They are proper scary. And they are dedicated to what they're doing in a way that only elves can be. Other species in the Warhammer world have lives. Even when their lives are taken away from them and they're focused in and trained at something, and they think that they are dedicated in an extreme way, they still have ultimately lives. Elves, when they are focused on something, kind of don't. Their life is what they're doing. And when it comes to the assassins, their life is being Khaine. They are mortal representations of Khaine in the material realms. And they do it really, really, really well. And they are hired out, obviously, by the good old witchy elves to anyone who's willing to pay them. Because, hey, Khaine, murder time.
Hey, we're a religion. We gotta have the bank. We gotta fill the coffers. The Dark Elf assassins are particularly interesting because even by the cruel and bloodthirsty and often fairly brutal standards of Dark Elves, assassins are something else. They are literally mentally broken individuals. They have
a different mentality. They are mentally focused.
Well, it's like they don't have a concept of fear of death. They just don't. Like other elves can be scared by things, but assassins, like a lot of the times when you have stories written from their perspectives, they're more like machines than an actual living person.
But you know what? I'll go as far to say that often when you look at elves, when they're sitting on their extremes, so those that are following a particularly extreme version of what it is to be an elf, they are like machines. And that goes across the board. The perfect mariner that happens to be out there, or the perfect leader of men, or the leader of the Phoenix King. They are all sitting on weird extremes where they have to be the absolute epitome of everything they are. Just take a look at Tyrion or Teclis, or indeed any of them. Elves are proper dialed up to 11 characters. Well, they don't do anything by halves.
Yeah, it's like even then though, you look at like most elves, you're like, oh, you got your like leadership 9s, but they can still feel fear and terror. And it's like assassins are immune to like leadership 10.
I mean, even if you just take a look, Malekith is the same. It's not just he's leadership 10, he's also immune to all psychology, pass all tests. Elves are crazy when they reach those peaks and pinnacles.
The other thing about assassins, to showcase just how obscene they are, is that Malekith once, unfortunately for him no longer, had a personal champion. And of all the things he could have chosen, of all the ways he could have raised this personal champion to be the greatest thing he did, he chose to raise him as an assassin.
I'm straight.
This being Urien Poisonblade. And Urien was fucking insane. Like, Urien was so fucking scary that when he called out for duels from the High Elves, he literally fought like 2 or 3 of the greatest High Elf mortal champions at the time and bodied them. It wasn't even like I think the first guy he fights is some big prince and he instantly kills him. It's described as like a man fighting an infant. It was so bad. Then he fights the old captain of the White Lions, and that's at least a fight, but Urien still kills him. And then Tyrion kills him through luck. Though, unless you're reading the 8th edition story, in which case Morathi gets involved and is why Urian dies. But they also I actually really like the way they do in the Tyrion Teclis book, where Urian lives among the High Elves for a long time because he's an infiltrator. He's being an assassin, and he actually develops a relationship with Tyrion despite himself. And this plays a role into the moment, the split second of an opening that Tyrion gets that allows Tyrion to kill him. And Tyrion's fucking Anarian reborn. Assassins are fucking bonkers. And once again, this is just another aspect of Khaine worship. So we've seen here 3 very distinct paths of Khaine worship in a warrior culture through your witch elves, your assassins, and your Hargoneth executioners, which is fucking fascinating.
Yeah, I agree completely. I mean, loosely, what we've got is the cult of Khaine in the Dark Elves, and the cult of Khaine expressed with, if you want to use the term priestess, we have priestesses who are the death hags who sit at the top, the oldest of them, and they are leading this cult, and this cult has multiple different branches, all of which express being Khaine in a different way. One being the bride of Khaine and exulting in everything that Khaine does and impressing Khaine with great feats on the battlefield. Another that exalts Khaine by being the perfect expression of a murderer, an assassin working behind the scenes, and then ultimately your executioners, who are the perfect killers, who do it with such artistry and causing such pain that Khaine himself can't help but look on with his easily diverted view and go, oh, well done, chaps. They are all about being super hyper extra, because that is what attracts Khaine's interest. Hyper extra. A lot of people complain at Dark Elves for loosely being a bunch of edgelords, for want of a better way of describing it. But in some respects, that is how they are written, because Khaine himself is the ultimate teenager wearing a death metal t-shirt, looking around at all these incredibly big, buxom elves doing crazy things, crazy murders, all worshipping and exalting him. And rather than saying, which would be the easy thing, that Morathi had twisted the cult to her own ends, so that she can use something to fashion the Dark Elves into something for her son, it would be better to say Morathi knew who Khaine was. That's it.
Yeah, she let him out.
Made the cult because Khaine was the perfect one for it, because Morathi was Khaine's first bride. If anyone is going to know Khaine better than anyone else and what's going to impress him, it's Morathi. Now, you might say that that bride is metaphorical. It literally doesn't matter. She is repeatedly referred to as the first bride, who got the cauldrons of blood, who started the whole process off for what is the modern day cult of Khaine inside all of Nagaroth. It is very much a construction that she put in place, but it's not her rules that are in place, it's Khaine's.
Yeah, Khaine, that is probably the most fascinating thing about him, is there are times where, especially if you're looking at the cult of pleasure, where Khaine actively moves against Morathi, even though he still does favor her. But that does not mean that he backs her.
Yeah, I think a perfect example of that would be, it's Father's Day. I'm a dad. And my 5-year-old kid decides that it's time to put a screwdriver inside a socket. Now that is going to electrocute the silly child and cause the child extreme pain. So I come over and say no and pick up the child and put it somewhere else. That would be a perfect example of Morathi perhaps doing some things that Khaine doesn't like. Khaine doesn't slap her down, which I think is a really important thing to note, because she never is on the receiving end of those gods' ire, ever. She has somehow managed to play off this balancing act where multiple gods favor her. And I do mean multiple. Authority clearly does. I would argue Slaanesh clearly does. Slaanesh favors her. Authority favors her. Khaine favors her. Multiple deities favor her. And different writers have all taken their perspective, which is to say, I think it's this god. Boom! And I'm going to focus on that god only and say that she's dedicated to it. Where the truth appears to be, she's far more savvy than to ever subject herself to any one god.
Yeah, her escape from the wrath of authority is a really funny story, but we don't have time for that today. Oh no, we already did this one. It's the one after this. Thank you, by the way, Playboy. The red guy, Axes of Grimnir versus the Sword of Khaine. So
yeah.
This one is once again really fascinating. But the Axes of Grimnir, it's another one of those circumstances where the Axes of Grimnir, how do I say this? The ancestor gods are not the same kind of god that elf gods are. There is a big difference between the two of them.
Okay. Let's be relatively blunt as I finish off eating a bit of bar. Our ancestor dwarves are Old One empowered dwarves. The elven gods are gods. The ancestor gods were capable of creating artifice of extraordinary might because they had access to information that others simply didn't, presumably through the old ones. So the artifacts that they're creating are going to be very powerful, but they're not the Sword of Khaine. Now, that doesn't mean that the Sword of Khaine, I mean, how do you even pitch these things against each other? It doesn't matter. They hit each other. The Sword of Khaine bounces off an incredibly powerful axe, whatever. It doesn't make any difference. What really does make a difference is when that sword is drawn, the world changes. Everything changes.
Yeah.
Everything. It's massive. When the Axe of Grimnir is wielded, if they manage to get it towards a bad guy, it will probably die. I mean, that's about it. It's just an artifact in the world, which, if you have it in the right place, can make a big difference. The Sword of Khaine changes the world when it's drawn. It is imbued with divine might and authority.
Yeah, it's like, it's kind of one of those things where it's like, you know, if you had like Gotrek or someone of like a really high caliber wielding both Axes of Grimnir, could they go up against someone wielding the Widowmaker? Sure. Yeah, probably.
But the world have changed because he had both axes. That's the big one. It's more than just can it hit something. It's the fact that it changes the world, and not necessarily in a good way, because we know quite a lot more about who Khaine is now. He is an edgelord. He is mental. It is going to go bad for the world.
Yeah, I would, someone joked about it earlier, but literally the only item I am aware of in the setting that has as much power and gravitas as the Sword of Khaine is like the Nemesis Crown and maybe the Throne of Power of the Dwarves. Because those are two items that have like the fates of entire races will be changed when something happens with them. And even then, the Sword of Khaine is still another tier higher because it's simply if you draw it. Like, I guess you could argue the Nemesis Crown is kind of in that category, but it's a very different item.
Well, you didn't answer the last.
Oh, I didn't.
Nope.
Oh yeah. This is actually
we covered this earlier, and the answer canonically is yes. However, you tend to find there are a lot of people that do not like mixing up human gods and elf gods, or dwarf gods and elf gods, or whatever. They like them to be discrete. That includes some writers. But canonically, in multiple places, they are exactly the same deity. They're just worshipped differently. And humans are worshipping Khaine as a god of murder. And Khaine is exulting in what they do and very much liking it. And there's a lovely piece of lore for those of you who like looking for it that pretty much confirms it as a small aside, and that's that the elven rune for Khaine is basically a scorpion. When you take a look at it, it's got that same 8 arachnid look to it. Khaine and Khaine are one and the same, in the same way that Mathlan and Manan are one and the same.
Yeah, there's a really funny thing about there are some, I think it's the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition Bestiary has some Dark Elves in it that talk about Khaine worship. And there's a really funny thing about how they feel about humans worshiping Khaine, where they believe it is actually Khaine they're worshiping, but they're doing it in such a stupid way that to them it's like, you know, dealing with a god where you feel like you should be painting the Sistine Chapel, and then you look over and there's some child over there with a box of crayons drawing on the wall, and you're like, I guess.
Equally, Dark Elves are massively manipulative. It will not be beyond them to use those cults to their own ends. If
Oh yeah,
and
oh
when
yeah.
they
There's
can.
some really funny
Yeah.
notes about how certain Dark Elves feel about it, where some of them see it as an insult, and others of them just are like, they're trying their best. But I will say, I don't remember which book it's in. There is a really fun human cult of Khaine, that's mentioned in a Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay story, where it's a group of folks that get together once a year, and they have a contest to see which of them can most can praise Khaine the best. And what it is that they meet up in a different city every year, and they each have to commit a very elaborate murder. And whoever commits the most artistic, elaborate, over-the-top murder is that year's victor. So they give you like the scenario of what they're kind of like, these individuals, so that your party can be in the city at the same time these guys are enacting their plan and dealing with the ramifications of it. And it's a really, really, really fun storyline.
And it is ultimately just a simplified, debased version of Death Knight.
Yeah. Still loading. Would you say Khaine regulates a balance between extremes, going from mean violence to nice heart?
Nice.
Nice represents a lost desire for balance.
I would argue that all the Chaos Gods represent a chaotic over excess of a particular thing, where Khaine is far more regulated about it. Yes, I wouldn't use the word nice.
Yeah. Unless you mean nice, in which case, sure. That's a different kind of nice. Nintendo, on the cover of the Dark Elves book, 4th edition, there's a witch with ridiculous white hair and the corn emblem. You know what the deal with her is? It's just an old depiction of witch elves.
Okay, so that's from Dave Gallagher, as I recall. And as I also recall, although this might be just apocryphal nonsense, as I recall, the golden breast coverings that she's wearing used to be far smaller before it was repainted. But that could just be something that I heard back in the day. I can't even remember who told me that, but I remember getting told that. Could be a lie. So there's a couple of things to say here. This is written back in an era when the only Dark Elf god was Khaine, and that the cults of the Chaos Gods were seen as something to be used by the elves. Seeing symbols of chaos with elves were not necessarily an uncommon thing, but they weren't so much fallen to chaos as they were using chaos. So this is a relatively common theme. The white hair, though, is something that has long been associated with Khaine's desire. White hair for witch elves is almost a thing. It's repeated in several sources, most of them old. I can't think of the newest one off the top of my head. The white hair is the witch elf standard. That red lips, pale flesh.
It is their standard in 8th edition fantasy.
Yeah, well. I can't remember what the 8th edition description is, but the white hair is favored by Khaine. He likes it. It is his preference. And Malekith himself, interestingly, has white hair, if you should ever see him underneath. In the few descriptions we have of him outside of his armor, he has white hair.
There you go. Marathi, Nagaron's Mom of the Year every year.
Every single year.
I'm sure she doesn't mess with that vote at all. It's totally legit. Tradition, are Khaine and Mor brothers? Are they on good terms?
Yes, they're twins. So this is human belief, not necessarily elven belief, because if we went by elven belief, we'd then be saying that Morai Heg and Khaine are twins, which is very different. And that's not said anywhere, but it doesn't mean it's not the case. But the brothers thing originally came from the Cain and Abel myth and the murder myth. And Mor has been murdered by Khaine. Mor's dead. Mor has been murdered a long time ago, and he lives because he's a god. You just don't die. He then moved over into the afterlife, and that is where he rules. And that did not go down very well with certain people. The weapon that was used to kill Mor is called the Grieve. It's one of the 100 weapons that were made for Khaine by Vol, and there was, let's say, a dispute. And Mor moved over into the afterlife because of this. That dispute could be repitched entirely as that was their intent and their plan, and the weapon was made so that they could move into the afterlife and take control of it to ensure that, for example, certain souls wouldn't go to the Chaos Gods. There's lots of ways we could repitch that, But in terms of the story as it currently stands in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, until it gets rewritten again, and again, this is a myth, so don't take it as this is the case. It's just a myth. They're twins, and Khaine killed more.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very much on the human side of things. Which is always funny when an elf gets involved in those particular discussions. What drug does Slaanesh like? Kurt, cocaine. Thank you, Hammond. It's good to see you're still alive.
I shouldn't laugh at that because it was a bad joke, but it made me laugh. Thanks.
John, you might say the Harkonnen executioners studied the blade while others were getting laid, but then they got laid later anyways. Yeah.
Yeah, they pretty much did. Because the elves. There's one thing you can be certain about Warhammer elves is if there's an opportunity for them to get laid, they almost certainly will. Just as a small aside on this, elves don't view sex in the same way humans do. We have a bajillion cultural taboos wrapped up with sex that makes it a very difficult thing for certain people to talk about. We have religious trappings that attach to people who might not be religious, but they have been brought up with those particular set of moral beliefs. The Dark Elves, and indeed the High Elves and the Wood Elves, have none of this. Literally none. Sex to them is just another expression of intimacy, much like kissing or hugging or a variety of other things. But unlike some other things that put you in a state of physical, let's say, danger. So for Dark Elves, it's almost a challenge because if you're not wearing clothes, you've got nowhere to hide your blades. And that's scary, scary business, particularly if the other person is clothed. So there's a host of cultural differences for how they view sex, which when you add the Dark Elf element, turns it into almost an exciting game rather than necessarily how we view sex. For them, there's the excitement of this could kill me.
Yeah. Also, random fun fact of that, to put it in perspective how casual elves are about sex, it's considered really, to the point that it's called out almost every edition, it's considered very, very, very weird that Tyrion does not sleep around. Like he sleeps with Alariel and that's it. He doesn't sleep with anybody else. And pretty much the rest of High Elf, remember, High Elf society looks at that and goes, something's wrong with that boy. Something's weird with him. Mendata, thank you very much. We appreciate that. Argonauts Executioners are my favorite elven unit in all of Warhammer. Their discipline of perfection. Seeking their equivalent was my first look in 40k. If I can find enough models, I may well sell my Wood Elf army in favor of a Hargoneth Blood Host.
Yeah. If Lindsay wasn't collecting Dark Elves as one of her armies in the background, I probably would give them a go again, even though they're not part of the old world just now. Really, largely because they are a much maligned army for very good reasons. The reasons that they're maligned are often misunderstood. So I quite enjoy reveling in the fact that people kind of hate them, which makes them kind of fun to play. I've played, for example, the Total War game as the Dark Elves multiple times just because it makes me laugh. They are hilariously silly, but I quite enjoy playing them.
Yeah, I will note that it is also really funny that whenever you meet someone that hates Dark Elves, trying to guess why they hate Dark Elves, is it because of the lore, or is it because they played certain editions and fought a Dark Elf player and went, this game sucks, I hate everything?
Seventh Ed, Dark Elves were good.
Fuck anyone who plays Dark Elves, I'm out. I'm out.
Yeah.
Because there have been a couple editions where Dark Elves were bullshit. Hey man, Ancestor Gods equal Power Rangers. The Widowmaker is Goku. That's an
interesting comparison, and obviously it's said flippantly, but there is a certain amount of truth in that the Ancestor Gods are extremely powerful entities. But Widowmaker is on clearly a different level, multiple gods fashioning something to kill the Chaos Gods, because ultimately that seems to be what they were made for.
Nightbringer 325. Skimpy clothes and white hair shows Khaine has a type. He does have a type. He is a.
I'm going to go further than skimpy clothes and say that they're normally naked. The skimpy clothes is because Games Workshop are making the models, and they have to sell them to kids. Whenever you read the descriptions, it's almost always, yeah, they're naked. They're running around naked. They're naked. Oh, by the way, they're naked. Also, they're naked. And if you see the picture of, say, for example, Marathi in, I think, 6th Ed, when she's sitting on her swooping down, she's got at least one of her breasts out. I wonder why, Slaanesh. But They are typically naked, so that's just a thing. But they won't be showing that very often.
For the sake for our world's cultural reasons, they're not depicted as nude in the art and the minis, but in the lore, they almost always are completely nude.
And I'll also say that for all I say voluptuous, I mean voluptuous by elven terms. That means that they just look like they have breasts. A lot of elven women are not the most voluptuous at all, actually.
Phil, on the topic of Khainite cults among men, how would dwarf and elves see humans worshiping their various gods? These races usually show such contempt for men that I can't imagine them taking very kindly to it.
Yeah, so I think here that we have to make something relatively certain. The elf gods aren't elf gods. They're gods.
Yeah, they're just gods.
They are gods, and the elves are their favored children. That is written multiple places. And the elf gods are worshipped across the Warhammer world by other species as just gods, because they are. They're very powerful etheric entities that work through the mortal realms if you interact with them. They do not exclusively work with the elves. They work with other species, and we have multiple examples of that being the case. So for all we say the elf gods, it would be better to say the Warhammer gods, the great pantheon of Warhammer gods that's out there. And this pantheon, because there's more than one pantheon, this pantheon favors the elves, but also works through humans, for example. So how do the elves think about that? They generally think the humans have got it all wrong and say it repeatedly. Teclis, for example, famously says that all the priests that are supposedly having miracles aren't. They're just latent spellcasters who are channeling spells. The gods don't do that. You've got it all wrong. Your own self-belief is powering this. That's it. Why didn't you come down and sit with me and I'll teach you how to be a proper wizard, you idiot? Where they think the opposite. They think the gods are empowering it. And the evidence is that they are correct. So possibly both sides are right in this. Yeah, there's different lines you can take.
There's a whole funny thing. If you ever have a chance to pick up the Liber Chaotica, I want to say in the Tzeentch section, there's a big treatise by Volkmar the Grim. And if you go check out our Volkmar Lorebeards episode, we talk about a fair bit about it, where Volkmar is very much of the opinion that Teclis is right and wrong simultaneously. Because he says, the idea, and Volan, there's a letter from Volan's as well that talks about how fucking confusing it is to the Wizards of the Empire that priests are manifesting these insane miracles that are so much more powerful than what wizards are capable of at times. Despite the fact that
being dispelled. That's the big one. They're just not dispelled. So how can they possibly be magic? And I ran with that as well, because I spoke to Marianne about what he'd written inside Liber Chaotica, and I was like, I want to run with this further. So when we were doing the Tome of Salvation, I duplicated, not the same words, but I duplicated the opinions to other people, where Teclis was absolutely certain he was correct. And that led to uncertainty afterwards, as the various human wizards, magisters, whatever, were just looking at it going, WTF? What? This doesn't make any sense. And muddying the waters like that for Warhammer generally is better.
Yeah, and I will say that would be one of the, turning the attention back to Khaine here. Well, I'll get to this super chat in just a second. But to finish off that kind of thought, one of the things that's really interesting is that obviously among elves, you do not see priests like you do among humans, where they're casting miracles or prayers that have like immediate impacts. They just cast spells, or they're using magical artifacts that cast like bounce spells. Like the Cauldron of Blood is used by the hags, hag witches, to unleash bounce spells that allow Khaine to influence the battlefield. The thing about humans that can make humans exceedingly dangerous compared to other species is humans having this very bizarre ability to invoke the power of gods in a way that they don't know any spell casting. They don't know how to use the words of magic. And just through this bizarre power of Polite, they manifest their god's will into affecting the world. So you could have a priest of Khaine who is a human who reaches a point where he is able to make prayers and miracles to Khaine that work. And that would be really fucking terrifying. And it's something that canonically exists, but like from elves, it would be really weird.
I wrote the spells for that. So yeah, it definitely exists. Well, sorry, the prayers. I wrote the prayers for that. It definitely exists. I quite enjoyed writing those. They were super fun. And it's a part of the established Warhammer world. And we can't get away from that, nor do I think that we should do. The elves are trapped underneath their own paradigm, and their paradigm here is that the gods cannot, under any circumstance, influence the material mortal realms. And the reason for that is because Azurin has forbidden it. It can't be done. The only way to do it is to circumvent that particular commandment. And what the humans are doing doesn't circumvent it. It basically breaks it, and they think it's wrong. They're wrong. Clearly, they are wrong. Because what humans are doing is not simply latent magic. There is definitely divine purpose there. Now, as to the way that that's manifesting, then they might have it wrong. The humans might have it wrong. There is a great deal of gray there, but the elves are both right and wrong in what they're saying.
So, Corin Chima, how's the relationship between Hoeth and Khaine? So Hoeth, of course, was a god that was in this week's vote. Unfortunately, he didn't manage to pull it out, but he tried his best. I actually think there's probably some really interesting things here that are not, I will say, I don't know of anything that's expressly noted about the relationship between the two of them, but I think the fact that Hoeth's sword masters are eerily similar to the Hargoneth executioners, though different, where sword masters are more an expression of learning many different styles of swordplay and truly mastering all aspects of swordsmanship, whereas Hargoneth executioners are more about mastering a very specific concept and ideal taken to an utter extreme. I think like Andy said earlier, we only see it mentioned a couple times, normally around Vol, of Khaine going to other gods and being like, do something for me, and they do something for him. But I think Hoeth would be another one of those gods, of Khaine approaching Hoeth and say, I wish to know all about this. Teach me the wisdom, the learning of this concept. And Hoeth being like, oh, geez, all right, I'll write you a book.
So, yeah, so there's pretty much nothing. So a lot of it's going to have to be extrapolated. One, he's Kadai, so he is on the heavenly host side. He is a follower of Azurin's divine plan. He believes in that particular plan of seeing that through. And even after Azurin was dead, he continued seeing that particular plan through, which means that he is directly contested by Khaine. Khaine is on the other side. He no longer follows the divine plan of Azurin. Indeed, the divine plan of Azurin, fuck that noise. We've got to kill chaos our own way. Thanks very much. And he's doing his own thing, which means that Hoeth is effectively a rival who is trying to do things differently. And we know what happens to most of Khaine's rivals. He kicks them in, he bullies them, he gets what he wants out of them. Take a look at Isha and what he did to her. Take a look at Kurnos. Take a look at Vol. Indeed, take a look at any of the gods that stand against him. If there's something that Khaine wants, he's going to come and try and take it from you. One of the characteristics we know of Hoeth is that Hoeth has got the Sword of Judgment, which is also called Tlaxla, as I recall. It's a weapon that's almost certainly a weapon of the old ones that was taken probably from the Lizardmen or something similar. It was rumored in one of the stories to have been taken directly from one of the gates of chaos, where it was taken. And he came with the Sword of Judgment to the pyramid where the last of the Kadai were making their last stand before Azurin returned. And he was seen to be the great figure that returned because he had the Sword of Judgment, and that would potentially help him. And that Sword of Judgment is very much what the Swordmasters are emulating, that great swordplay, which also, it's worth noting, the Grey Magisters also emulate. The very symbol of the Grey Wind is a great sword, the Sword of Judgment. They're all connected because they're all following the same world model. So we don't really have anything for them. Other than, if Khaine wanted something from him, he would be a rival. Unless Hoeth, in his wisdom, helped him. There is most certainly a story that's not been told there, but that's not especially unexpected, because when it comes to the early stories of the Elven gods, the stories about them are few and far between, often contradictory, and sometimes not particularly well written as well. So we don't have a great deal to draw from there.
Yeah, because depending on which versions of the War in Heaven you look at, there are some that go as far to say that like all 20, except for Ashur until the very end, were involved in some kind of civil war punch-up in their own different ways. But, they also might have been involved in ways that you would not expect. in the sense that they might not, Hoeth might not necessarily been on the front lines. He might have been doing something much more important in the background. There's a reason that Hoeth is actually one day I hope he will win a vote, because there is he doesn't seem that crazy or wild at first, but if you squint, and once again, thinking about how much we can learn about Khaine by studying the various ways his worshippers act. Hoeth, the second you start looking at sword masters and lore masters and wizards and stuff, you start going, whoa, okay, there's some things going on here.
Hoeth is a warrior.
And
that's an unexpected component of him. And there's at least one example of him literally being swooping in to save the day. But also, interestingly, in that story, he is directly equated to Verena, and is marked as being effectively Verena as well. So there's an awful lot of crossplay here.
Yeah, and that's just one of those really classic things. So, elves are wrong. Music to my round ears.
Yeah, elves get things wrong every once in a while, but that's because, much like all of the species of the Warhammer world, they are trapped within their own paradigms, their own thought processes, and their own cultures. And according to them, their worldview is their right. They understand the world better than anyone else. They believe they understand it better than the lizardmen, better than the humans, better than the dwarves, better than chaos, better than anyone. All elves of all stripes, regardless of what particular type they are, just think they're better. They are arrogant motherfuckers. No other way of putting it. And that means that sometimes they make enormous errors, particularly when it's something that has been a part of their culture and has been understood to be a part of their culture for not just centuries, but millennia. And when the elves eventually make strong ties and connections to the people of the old world, approximately 200 or so years before the world goes boom, and they arrive and they see humanity for what it is, rather than their version of it, which is seen through a very twisted and distorted lens of they are primitive and extremists and we are a billion times better. And they start seeing it. Some of them stick to their guns and go, we're right. Others start getting interested. Some of them even start writing letters and having conversations with scholars of the elves, the humans, pardon me, and working down the generations. So they end up sending letters to a position, not an individual. So whoever happens to be, for example, the head of divinities in one of the universities, the elf will talk to the head of divinities, because they know that by the time the fourth letters come, he's probably going to be dead. So they speak to the title rather than the individual. And those letters, some of which pop up in the background every once in a while, constantly show the elves taking a superior position and always claiming that they know what's going on. But the central component of what's going on is often not quite what the elves are claiming as well. The most core one of that being what is happening with divine magic, for want of a better term.
Yeah, I think one of the best things you see with elves is when you get an elf character stuck in a room trying to deal with what is Sigmar. Because it makes it much more difficult for them to fall back on their classic strategy of, oh, well, that's just one of our gods, because it's like Sigmar showed up pretty late in the game.
He's the demon prince.
Yeah, which opens another fun can of worms. If elves cannot channel divine magic, then how does their priestly class affect the world? Do they simply just follow the paths like they do in
Magic. Yeah, they use magic. Spells. They use spells. That's what they do. In fact, they say that in multiple places. Take a look at the Loremasters of Hoeth doing their Loremaster thing. They are basically disciples of Hoeth. And what are they doing? They're studying magic. And they're often studying magic through filters of other gods as well, particularly the gods that might have provided them with benefits. Take a look at the Dark Elves. They are studying the works of Hecate, and Hecate is the one that dived deep into dark magic and everything that it could offer. And again, they're not doing divine miracles. They are studying magic and how it works in the real world. Take the elves. They're basically like scientists. They study the world for what it is, and they get true effects. And they believe that the science has been given to them by their gods so that they can better express that magic. And bluntly, they're better at magic than pretty much almost anyone else in the world. So they're probably correct. And humans, when it comes to their divine magic, aren't scientists. They're just fumbling along, right, reading rituals that they've written down in books, desperately hoping that it will come to pass, and it does. And that confuses a lot of people.
Yeah, and this is also Nightbringer, although you're making a hilarious Tyranid joke here. I assume it's a Tyranid joke, but I will say this is what makes like the new lore for Khaine so exciting. Of this really powerful, magically juiced ancient race cropping up that looks at the likes of the elves and a lot of the really ancient, like, oh, they know everything factions, and turns and looks at them going, no, you guys are idiots. We know what's actually going on. Y'all are just fucking morons that are being duped by these gods. And that makes the world really exciting because it adds in another really confusing perspective of, like, if you were to have like the Khaine dragons move into the room and ask them about their thoughts on Khaine, they would have some very choice words for the elves about Khaine and their gods.
Look at the Dark Elves and how horrific they are.
Yeah, of like the Khaine dragons looking at them and saying, like, we're older than these things. And like, we know that y'all are fools. You're fools that are falling for something because you're emotional little children. Which is a weird thing for an elf to be told.
Yeah, absolutely. But just to bring up a small side comment there and just say, I was being somewhat flippant.
I do think that's what an elf would unironically try to say, which would probably cause them to get burned at a stake. But
yeah, quite. If I was to take a sentence or two to be a little bit more elaborate on that, it would be that he has ascended like a demon prince has ascended from being a mortal to being an immortal entity inside the aether, as the elves refer to it, or the warp, if you wish to be a little bit more 40k and old school, or the realms of chaos, if you prefer, but has ascended into the divine realm. This is something that happens a lot in the Warhammer world. It is not all demon princes are that. And some demon princes are so powerful that they are almost as powerful as the chaos gods themselves. We've discussed that in the past. Shut, perhaps. Be'lakor, definitely. There are various entities that have risen from being mortal and have become gods. And Be'lakor is effectively that. And Sigmar is not so different, which is why I rather flippantly said, he's just a demon prince. No, he's not. He's a god. But then you could say the same for some demon princes. They are effectively gods. The interesting thing about demon princes is that the chaos ones can return to the mortal realms and do so frequently. And I find that fascinating because then you have to say, why isn't Sigmar? And that is a far better question.
Yeah, and please, for the love of God, if you're trying to answer that question, come up with a better one than the End Times. The End Times answer to that question was really dumb.
Bullshit.
I got stuck in a Azir for like, oh man, I got lost. So many twists and turns in Azir. Crazy.
Yeah, because time exists over there, right?
Yeah, sorry, my bad. I got stuck. Just kept making the wrong left turn. You know how it is.
Funny. Yeah.
Oh, anyway, Khaine. So like I said, hopefully the stream did a good job showing there are cases where a lot of the times people will come to fantasy and ask about like the connections between 40k and fantasy. And Khaine, I think, is one of the best examples to show that it's not as simple as giving a flippant answer of, oh, well, they're completely separate and unrelated. And like, you should never worry about 40k when dealing with fantasy because it doesn't matter. Like, there are times where it is really important. And there are ways that both universes have reflected onto one another in ways that a lot of the people who are reading the stories nowadays don't realize. Khaine is a magnificent example of this. Now, granted, I will admit that I'm super biased and that I prefer all of the fantasy versions of everything compared to their 40k counterparts. But there are a lot of really fascinating stories here. And I will fully admit that the 40k version of Khaine made the fantasy version of Khaine so much better. So much better.
Agreed.
It's just that at some point they eventually set off on their own paths away from one another. But there are a lot of really fun ideas that you can explore that we talked about in the stream. Like, of course, talking with the not explicitly a LAWhammer verse thing, but is being more heavily explored in LAWhammer verse of the paths of the elves and how you can see that idea existing already within the Hargoneth Executioners, the Assassins, and the Witch Elves. Of if that you were playing a elf character in fantasy and you were like, oh, well, I would want to use a path system. What could I base this off of? I would look to those tabletop careers as your inspirations for what your paths might look like.
Absolutely. And I would like to mirror that comment in general when we say that in early Warhammer and Warhammer 40k, the links and bridges between the two were deep, and they weren't just the Chaos Gods. And I think that they express most deeply with the Elves and the Eldar. They are, in many ways, very, very similar. And it has been broadly to the benefit of both. Now, I'm actually in general preference of get the fuck out of my Warhammer 40k. That's generally where I sit. Nevertheless, I grew up with Warhammer and 40k being written by the same people, telling the same stories in two settings. And that to me wasn't controversial. Back in those days, people didn't say, oh, do you think they're linked? Because that wasn't a question. They would say instead, is Sigmar a Primarch? That would be the question, because 40k and Warhammer were linked. But it got separated by Games Workshop, because Games Workshop wanted to ensure that Warhammer kept its own unique identity and just wasn't one tiny world in 40k, because it diminished Warhammer. Now, obviously, there's a lot more to do with that situation than that alone, but that's bluntly and loosely one single reason for why it was very important for them to ensure that they were separated. But nevertheless, the warp still connects everything, and the Elven Gods are a core component of that. And if you're telling a tale of what happened, then the Elven Gods, the Eldar Gods, weren't killed by the bursts of Slaanesh. They were thrust into the Warhammer world, or they were pushed to there alone as they fled. That would be one way of pitching it if you wished. But more importantly, for the Warhammer's tale, the Elven Gods are real. Khaine is real. Khaine is not just something that sits off in the realms of chaos or the divine realms being, shall we say, an esoteric, weird god thing that no one understands. The opposite. Khaine walked the Warhammer world, was actually in the material plane. And Khaine, when the great cataclysm came, went against chaos. The gods that he went against were extremely powerful, took advantage of the situation as it was, as magic flooded the world, and the gods shook the world because they were extraordinarily powerful. You could argue that the Chaos Gods' plan was for those gods to die, to fight, because it shook the very foundations of the world. Eventually, Azuran himself, having died, removed himself from the world, comes back and bans all gods from being on the material plane, because the material plane can't cope and chaos will win. Khaine is kicked out. He doesn't like it. So Khaine continues to work from the other side, and his character never changes. His character, right from the outset, once chaos attacks, is, I am angry. I am really angry. I am enormously angry at what you have done, and I am going to stop you by any means possible. And that has reflected into Dark Elf society. The very nature of who Khaine is has reflected into the nature of the Dark Elves and who they are. But it's also worth noting that they are not solely that. They were once. And to begin with, particularly when we're looking at 4th edition through to around about 6th edition, I'd say more 4th to 5th, 6th less, they began to winnow it down, but it really got winnowed down in 7th. To begin with, Dark Elves were cackling bad guys, chaos worshipping sometimes, and often enormously bluntly written. And there wasn't a great deal of thought behind who they were and why they expressed. Malekith, for example, in the very first Dark Elf army list, is quite clearly marked as channeling chaos powers and doing all sorts of crazy stuff that later on gets completely changed. And the reason for this is because the god they chose, Khaine, to express it all, was made equally childish and over the top. And they water this down significantly in the later editions so that Khaine maintains all of his almost edgelord craziness. He is a murderer. He revels in slaughter. He likes to see the extraordinary pain, but I'm going to argue it's not because he likes it. It's because he hates it. Because he realizes that his beloved elves cannot exist unless they have that and fight, because they need to do that to fight. He's angry for a reason, because this has happened. Khaine is a much more complicated character than simply being the edgelord we have been cackling about throughout most of this stream, which is how he presents. But he himself has been written in multiple places as a god of extremes. He pushes all of that to occur so that the alternative can also be appreciated. He is not a god of pain and pleasure. No, he is a god of understanding your place in the world, and that the world, the material realm, fucking sucks. It's horrible. And the only way that you can live there and survive is to control it and be the one that is doing the punishing. Now, is this a childish, weird view of the world? Yes, but it is a philosophy that many people have in the real world. Yeah, it is. As scary as that is to say, there are people out there who believe they have to be the ones that are pushing the boot down and crunching others, and they take a certain amount of pride in being the ones that are doing that. They take an almost effervescent joy. And in some respects, Khaine has got that lying behind him all the way through. He is a dark god. He is elves when they are going to an extreme. And the Dark Elf society takes that extreme as their raison d'etre. But, as I say, it got watered down. Now we have lots of other gods that are on this side of can't get the word out, Kairathai side. I'm always going to say that word wrong and pronounce it differently every time.
I was going to say,
not Kadai side.
Yeah,
the underworld gods, those. They are all taking a route, which is we will do whatever is required to win, loosely. And Khaine goes way too far. And because Marathi and her influence on Dark Elf society led down that way, all Dark Elves go way too far. But I'm also going to say that High Elves do the same.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're on the other side.
Yeah, and it's also worth noting that despite everything we were saying about Khaine, it is still important to note that he is revered within High Elf and Wood Elf society as well, just with to not such an extreme degree. When appropriate. When they're going into battle, they call upon Khaine because it's time. It's appropriate at that time.
It's when the anger rises. Look inside your own heart. Do you ever get angry? Do you ever just, need to
Mr. Rogers?
react? So that's a start. Now get yourself into an elven heart where they have extremes of emotions all the time, and they're attempting to curb them and control them. But then they've got to go to the battlefield. Those curbs and those controls are no longer of any use. Indeed, they will probably break under the horrors of war. And that is when Khaine comes forward, because he revels in it. He comes out, and all the elves who are terrified because they are immortal creatures and their mortality is suddenly thrust upon them. And then Khaine is in their heart. And the one thing about elves that we have discussed before, and has left some going, oh, you're just elf fanboys when you say this. No, we're just describing elves as they are. Elves are crazy capable. You can't get the drop on an elf. You can't surprise an elf. They're just too sharp. Their senses are better. Their bodies are more agile. They are nevertheless still terrified, because if they lose 5, 10, 15 of them, that means that village is no longer protected. You lose another 100, then the city's endangered. Where if you lose 5, 10, 15 humans, that's nothing. The elves are a very small species. Even the Dark Elves, who, by comparison, breed like bunnies. As we've noted, it's a core component of Khaine worship. Breeding like bunnies. Away you go. Because they take all of the excesses they have on one side and they compare it to the excesses on the other. So, yeah.
Yeah, Todd, last little super chat here. how come one meld Khaine also being Khorne? Like, if you wanted to combine his lore references, it's both an Elven God and another name for Khorne. I mean, you can do that, and there are Khorne worshippers within the setting that very strongly proliferate this idea. Where you have Khornates like fighting against Khainites and them trying to bait essentially the Khainites by saying you are simply our god in a lesser form.
Yeah, and if you're looking to try and make this a part of one of your games, what I would suggest is that you take one of the Khainite cult cells, for example, and you twist it. So what you do is you remove approximately 3/4 of what it is to be a Khainite, and you focus on one thing only: the blood and the sacrifice, the blood and the war, the blood and the sacrifice. But that's not all they are. If that was, as we said earlier in the stream, all they were, then we would have Death Knight every night. But we don't, because there's a far more going on with Khaine than that alone. There's the perfection of what you're doing. There's the training. There is the relationships that you form with your brothers, your sisters, or whoever else is beside you. There's the fact that the counterpoint to much of their bloodshed is the orgiastic release that comes afterwards. There's the drugs, the fact that they put themselves into a state of mind where they can push themselves to the extremes. It's not their natural state. They are not Khorne worshippers by any measure, but they could easily be pushed in that direction if you start whittling away what it is to be Khaine, and you start saying, let's just add the bits that are Khorne and Khorne alone. So yeah, it's really, really easy to do, which is why I think so many people out there go, well, isn't it just Khorne? Really, if you think it's just Khorne, then your idea of how accepting Khorne is I think, probably wrong. Because Khorne is a chaos god and deeply, deeply weird. Khaine is far more certain.
Yeah, and I will say though, I do now have a hilarious mental image of like a college campus recruiter Khornate showing up somewhere in Nagaroth, being like, "Come to Khorne, it's Death Night every night." It's like,
yay! But no sex.
Yeah, but no sex.
None of that business. No. Well, we do Death Night proper. We just kill people all night.
Yeah, we just murder. That's all we do.
What's wrong with that?
And I will say, I just because I saw what I thought was an interesting discussion that's completely unrelated to what we're talking about, but I just wanted to point out to those of y'all discussing Hashit in the more recent comments, go check out our Zar Nagrin stream if you haven't. I think you'll learn a lot. I will say y'all's conversation about Hashit, I would say, is not very accurate to what Hashit is and how he's represented. Those are some interesting thoughts. Maybe go check out the Zar Nagrin stream and see if that elucidates anything for you.
Yeah, I recommend the Zar Nagrin stream in general, even if you're not that interested in Chaos Dwarves, because the Zar Nagrin stream went down a host of really fun Warhammer rabbit holes where we got to discuss why things are the way they are and what the natural extrapolation of that would be given Hashut's existence. So yeah, it's a pretty good one. Go take a check.
Yep. All right, and with that, we are out of time. So hopefully you all had a lot of fun and you got to enjoy various different aspects of learning about Khaine. We'll have another vote up here soon. The vote will be on the LAWhammer channel.
LAWhammer channel this time. Indeed. So that's over on my YouTube channel, which if you're on YouTube right now, will be up relatively soon over in the community tab. And if you're not on YouTube and you're over on Twitch right now, go over to YouTube because it'll be up soon on the community tab.
Yeah. And of course, for those that are interested, which tends to be a lot of y'all, and we really appreciate that, by the way, the finale of the Tarmakon Brothers stream will be on the Loremaster of Sotek channel this upcoming Wednesday at 6 p.m. CST, midnight BST. So be sure to join us for that. It should be fun. It's going to be Zinc, so it's going to get weird. And thanks to the last stream, we actually did a bizarrely good job of building like an overarching big narrative. I even think I'm going to make a map with some doodles over it for the next one. And of course, make sure you pick up that thing which Andy strokes so affectionately.
Father's Day. What better gift could you get for your father, yourself, your child,
your daddy,
than Dark Deeds? I mean, you could do it right now. All you need to do is pop over to Modifius' website, modifius.net, and you will find Dark Deeds available for pre-order right now. Oh, lovely. I enjoyed that stream. Thanks to everyone. There's I enjoyed that stream largely because most people tend to think that Khaine is silly, actually, and they're not wrong because he's been written silly in several places. But I think the overarching Khaine is much deeper and much more interesting than it has necessarily been laid out by what many believe. But if you just go with the cackling dark deeds version of the Dark Elves that you'll probably find in, say, Total War, then you're right to think they're a bit silly because they just come across as the most evil slave peddling horror shows that you can imagine, which they are.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is that you'll also hopefully have noticed during the stream that we just barely started touching on the idea of like what gods, which the gods are probably the biggest opening to this avenue, what they are, what they could be, and the fact that, like, you know, we talked about here that Khaine very canonically shows that the gods at some point physically manifested in the world and were walking around doing things. Which
the Cauldron of Blood went with Khaine when he went to war.
Yeah, you may look at that and go, what the fuck? I want to know more about that. To which I will say, well, then keep an eye out for when more gods show up on the votes. And if you see a god, you better fucking vote for him, because that's how we'll get into those kinds of conversations. All right, but
let me just answer this. When will Dark Deeds release? Very soon, actually. I'm sending off an email next week just to double check. I don't want to give the date just in case they're wrong, but I do mean very soon. I've already received my copy, which means that there's hopefully copies already winging their ways right now into various warehouses out there. So soon, but I'll leave that for Modiphius to announce because they're the ones that actually know.
But yeah, anywho, that wraps us up for this week. So thank you all again so much for joining us. We hope you had fun. We will see you on Wednesday, and if not Wednesday, then next Sunday. So take care.
Yeah, see you then. Bye.
Yep.